The Rostikov Legacy. The Malykant Mysteries. Book 1. By Charlotte E. English. Read by Wayne June.
Chapter 1. The bone forest at night is a dangerous place to be. The ground is marshy, spread with silent pools of water, waiting to catch the steps of the unwary. A permanent fog shrouds the air in the colder months. In winter, little can be seen of the landscape, save the twisted trees looming out of the dark, their branches reaching into the sky like stripped bones. Once in a while, though, the moon shines briefly from between layers of heavy black cloud, and the mists gleam bone-white in response. And even more rarely, a flicker of ghostly white near the black earthen ground begs to catch the eye, a glimpse of a marsh spectre, so easy to miss. The marsh spectre is not, as might be inferred, a spirit, but in fact a flower. It grows in only the wettest of marshes. Were its delicate petals to dry out, it would crumble and fade into the wind like a wraith. It crouches low to the ground, its foliage ash-gray, veined with silver. It is rare. The conditions for its growth are specific: a particular temperature, a significant degree of moisture, not too much light. Without these, it will never thrive, and its coveted blossoms, only one per plant, will never appear. On one particular frosty night, few souls were abroad to witness the delicate white glow of the marsh spectre as it unfurled its petals. Coveted as it was, few could brave the dangers of the night-shrouded bone forest with impunity. Konrad Savast was one such, and as he navigated with care through the dripping fog, a bright glow caught his eye, blazing briefly but powerfully in the grey forests that ringed the city of Ekamet. It was a light he recognized, for he had set out on this cold, wet night in search of this very blossom. Swirling his long, dark coat out of the way of his legs, he was on his knees in an instant, heedless of the ice-touched, waterlogged mud staining the thick fabric of his trousers. But he was not the first. He swore at finding himself too late to prevent this most virulent of poisons from being harvested, processed, sold, and, above all, used. The center of the flower was gone. Only a few petals remained. Konrad sat back on his heels, disturbed. Whoever had harvested this particular specimen was not a professional poison master. The drooping, bruised state of the few surviving petals spoke of the rough lack of care with which the valuable parts of the flower had been removed. When amateurs played at poison-craft, the results were never good. He closed his eyes and let his consciousness shift into the spirit world. In his mind's eye, the landscape drained further of color, becoming a faded tableau in hazy white. He could see the wind streaming through the trees, feel the faint traces left by the passage of wraiths through the ether. "Itapi," he murmured. "Utapi." An answering whisper touched his thoughts, and then a second close behind. Twin phantoms twined through his senses like a persistent cold wind, making him shiver. "Yes, Malykant," they both said together. "Search the ether," he told them silently. "Bring me news of the unquiet." His companions caught the ribbons of the wind and sailed away. He opened his eyes and watched them go, their long serpentine bodies fading into the mist. They had been brightly colored in life, their beaded hides advertising their venomous natures in vivid purple and red. In death they were moon-pale, insubstantial, and cold as winter. Abandoning the broken marsh spectre, Konrad straightened and continued on, picking his way expertly through the sluggish pools of water that saturated the forest. He threaded through the hillocks of drier land that dotted the landscape, ignoring the steady trickle of dampness that ran off the brim of his hat and flowed down the waxed cloth of his coat. After some minutes his workshop materialized out of the fog, a wooden structure raised on stilts high above the stagnant water. A rope ladder served as the only means of entrance. He climbed up it to his trapdoor entrance and let himself in. The pockets of his coat were stuffed with folded cloth packets. He drew these out one at a time, storing the fruits of his ramblings in the jars and boxes that crowded the shelves in his one room. Dark purple inkwort he had found in plentiful quantity, and sunbane and weak orange pepperroot. He'd even discovered a pocket of ash leaf sheltering on the lee side of one of the taller hillocks, hidden behind a mess of tall, prickly grass. Were it not for the loss of the marsh spectre, he would have considered it a fruitful day's work. Harvest stored, Konrad shrugged out of his coat, stepped out of his tall boots, and removed his hat. He flopped gratefully onto the rude and untidy bed, yawning. He had been walking all night and most of the day, covering many miles of the marsh in his search for the materials of his trade. But he would not sleep yet. Not until the serpents brought him the news from the spirit lands. He sensed their return as he framed this thought. They came billowing through his open door, bringing a renewed chill with them. He sensed agitation, some manner of disturbance in the normally placid minds of his familiars. "Peace, Utapi," he said to soothe them. "Utapi, what have you discovered?" "An unclean death," a hissing voice replied. "One of your kind, Malykant." He recognized the melodic tones of Utapi, her voice like the tolling of funeral bells. "We sense the displeasure of the Malikt," added Utapi in a voice like splintering ice. Konrad tensed. The Malikt was the spirit overlord who presided over the transition from life to death. And, incidentally, he was also Konrad's master. Years ago now, the Malikt had made Konrad his chief servant, granting him the serpent seers as his aides. As the Malykant, head of the Order of Death, Konrad's duties were clear. That the Overlord was displeased by this particular death did not bode well. It meant that it was time for Konrad to go to work. "Show me," he instructed, and the serpents complied, seizing his mind and carrying it away, back out into the marsh. Along the ether they sped, weaving through the ghostly trees, their essence mingling with the mist. Less than a mile from Konrad's workshop, a wide hillock rose out of the fog like a barrow, and here they stopped. The patch of ground was dry and largely bare of trees, clothed in short, half-frozen grass. Atop it lay the corpse, shreds of its soul still lingering at the scene of death. Konrad sensed the Malikt. The spirit lord had been here, drawn by the dank and acrid aura of defilement that polluted the air. An unclean death indeed. Konrad felt the Malikt's anger and shuddered under it. As he took note of these details, Konrad was distantly aware that his body followed where his mind had already gone, drawn inexorably through the trees until consciousness and physical form merged at the splayed feet of the corpse. He stood motionless for a moment as his mind and body merged once more, waiting until the dizziness faded away. When he felt stable, he opened his eyes. The corpse was a woman, and a young one, perhaps in her 20s. The dark hair was decorated with jewels, and she wore a fine gown. A knife was buried in her torso, a small weapon with a plain handle. But her blue tongue and blackened face told him that the stab wound had not killed her. Poison, he judged, and he could guess which. Marsh spectre. A blade coated in that sticky substance would have killed her within 5, maybe 10 minutes. That was far too long a time to suffer the vicious pain that this type of poison inflicted. Konrad frowned and crouched by the woman's side. Agony had distorted her features, but he recognized her. She had been a prominent figure in the city of Ekermet, owning a fine house in the center and much property besides. She had also been a popular society hostess. His frown deepened. What had Lady Navdina Rostikova been doing out in the bones? Wearing her finery, no less, and as far as he could tell, not a jewel was missing. "Utapi," he whispered. "Utapi, bind her." They did as he ordered, collecting the flickering shreds of her spirit and binding them together. There was not much of her soul left. Most had already fled into the Deathlands. He would be lucky to get anything out of her at all. The serpent seers dived into the corpse, dragging the sundered and shredded soul with them. The corpse choked, racked with violent shivers. Then Lady Rostikova's eyes opened and stared blankly at the sky. "Speak," he commanded. "Rostikova," the corpse gasped. "I am Lady Rostikova." "I am aware of your name. Who killed you?" "Rostikova," the corpse repeated. "I am Lady Rostikova." "That has been established. I ask the name of your killer." The corpse shuddered and said nothing. "Very well. Why were you here?" "I was meeting—" The dead eyes blinked. "Rostikova," it said again. "I am Lady Rostikova." Konrad said nothing further. He was too late. The distressed spirit had already fled too far. She was too confused and disoriented to be of any use. It hurts," the corpse gasped, shivering more violently than ever. "Release her," he ordered. The serpent shades streamed out of her, and the corpse collapsed back into inanimate silence, its borrowed breath escaping in a long sigh. Lady Rostikova's spirit frayed into ribbons and melted away. Recognizing his duty, Konrad bowed his head. "I am in the service of the Malykant," he said to the wind. "I do his bidding with respect and honor for the dead." He clasped his bone talisman as he spoke, protecting himself from the malignant influence of unquiet souls. Then he drew a long and wickedly sharp knife from his boot. Kneeling by the side of the corpse, he laid his blade to her torso and cut down. Layers of clothing parted and fell away, revealing her dead white skin. This too he carved through, cutting with strength and efficiency until he could see the wet gleam of her bones. Another few moments were all he required. With practiced movements he extracted one of the largest of her rib bones, wrapped it in cloth, and stored it in his coat. Later he would clean it and sharpen its ragged edges. Until he had found Lady Rostikova's killer, this piece of her body would remain with him at all times. "For the Malykant's justice," he said to the still night air. A gust of wind howled in response, brief and unnatural, and very, very cold. Chapter 2. Konrad went back to the city. He returned to his house discreetly, entering through a rear door that nobody else was permitted to use. He went straight to his dressing room and began the transformation from the Malykant, unkempt and smelling of the marsh, back into Konrad Savast, gentleman of Ekermet. He bathed, taking care to scrub all of the blood and mud from his olive skin. He washed and styled his black hair and anointed it with scent. He donned a fine linen shirt, a dark green silk waistcoat, and black trousers. His best black coat went over the top, and lastly he covered his head with a tall top hat. When his carriage came round to his door, no sign remained that Mr. Konrad Savast had done anything with his day, save enjoy the privileges of the wealthy. A servant handed him his favorite silver-headed cane as he left the house. He found that it gave him an air of refinement and authority, so he carried it with him everywhere, at least when he was in the city. Nobody had ever asked why the top was wrought into the shape of a serpent's head. "To Rostikov House," he directed his coachman as he got in. The carriage drew up a short time later in front of a large, detached mansion, somewhat over-decorated according to Konrad's taste, but he knew it was the fashion at present. As he had hoped, the house appeared quiet. Nobody yet knew of its mistress's fate. He stepped up to the front door and rapped smartly on it with his silver-headed cane. "Her ladyship is not at home," said the butler on opening the door. "That's all right," he replied gravely. "I'll wait." "Her ladyship left strict instructions that no callers are to be admitted." The butler started to close the door, but Konrad inserted his cane into the opening. "I said I'll wait," he repeated, and he allowed a little of the chill of the bone forest to enter his voice. He pushed his way into the house, shed his coat, and handed it to the manservant. "If you'd please to follow me, sir, I'll conduct you to the drawing-room," said the butler, his tone frigid with disapproval. "I prefer the study." Konrad made his way there without awaiting a response. He'd attended enough parties at the Rostikov house to be able to find it himself. "Shall you require any refreshment, sir?" Konrad waved a hand in dismissal. "Nothing, thank you. Just peace and quiet." The butler withdrew, his back stiff with offense. Konrad stood in the center of the room and surveyed Navdina Rostikova's private study. He knew that her husband had been a reading man, but apparently Navdina didn't share that interest, for very few books graced the shelves. Instead, they were crammed with ornaments and trinkets, many of them expensive, but most in poor taste. It was a wasted room, all space given to the frivolous and vulgar, instead of intellectual pursuits or business. The desk, though, that was a more interesting prospect. The top was well dusted and completely empty. But what of the contents? Konrad claimed the chair that sat before it and began opening drawers, quietly so as not to attract the notice of the servants whose footsteps he occasionally heard passing the door. Most contained nothing of interest, bills for household goods and invitations to parties. In one he found a stack of personal correspondence, and he devoted some minutes to perusing these, but found them useless. Most were mere vapid notes discussing gossip and fashion and new gowns. The bottom drawer was locked. Unconcerned, he touched icy fingers to the keyhole. Metal twisted and turned, and the lock slid open. In a matter of seconds, he had the drawer open and was browsing the contents. In it lay a single note, worked in handwriting that matched none of the other letters he had found. "There is but one way to settle this matter to my satisfaction. On New Moon night, meet me at the south gate at the 10th hour of the night. Do not think to bring an escort, for you will not need one." Konrad turned the note about in his hands, thinking. It bore no address or direction, so presumably it had been delivered by hand. Had Navdina been the intended recipient, or had she intercepted this note and entangled herself in someone else's business? Either possibility may have led to her demise. He pocketed the note, closed the drawer, and stood up. A search of the rest of the room revealed nothing of any further interest, only more tasteless, gilded ornaments. He waited until the hallway outside the study was quiet, then slipped out of the room. His coat hung on the coat rack near the front door. He retrieved it, shrugged it on, and left the house, quietly closing the front door behind him. "Home act so," he said to his driver. Once there, he went straight to his desk and composed a note of his own. He used plain block letters rather than his own handwriting, and he did not sign it. He wrote a single name on the front, Nuratov. This note was marked urgent and dispatched with all due haste to Egermet's police office. Konrad received the day's papers in bed the next morning, as was his custom. He read them at a leisurely pace, reveling in the comfort and luxury of a real bed after his 3 days and nights out in the bone forest. With his head cushioned by several pillows and a tray of hot chocolate and pastries at his elbow, he perused the primary headline of the day with considerable interest. A mysterious death. The popular society hostess, Lady Rostikova, was found dead last night. Her body was discovered more than a mile from the south gate, inside the treacherous marsh ground of the bone forest. It is not known why her ladyship so far departed from her usual habits as to travel out into the bones, a place wisely avoided by most good citizens of Hecamet. The cause of death is reported to be a knife wound in her ladyship's torso. Her torso was also split open and a bone taken, a known sign that the mysterious figure known only as the Malykant has already attended the scene. The murderer or murderers had better look to themselves, for the justice of the Malikt is swift and absolute. Konrad was not surprised that the police investigation had missed the signs of poisoning, or missed their significance, but it was this element that most interested him. Properly positioned, the knife alone would have been sufficient to kill the victim. Why use poison as well? And why choose such an agonizing one? The method had been chosen to inflict a slower, painful death upon the Lady Rostikova, and that suggested that the crime was personal in nature. But had Nabdina been the intended victim, or had she taken the poison meant for someone else? He needed more information. He glanced regretfully at his breakfast, only partially finished. He would like to enjoy his morning a little more thoroughly before he went out again. But the Malikt was an impatient master, swift and absolute indeed. Konrad would certainly ensure that the murderer's punishment was absolute, but the swiftness required a little more effort. With a sigh, he folded up the paper and laid it aside, and threw back the covers. Chapter 3. What Konrad needed was informants. He hadn't known Nabdina well himself. He couldn't hazard any guesses as to her close associates. But she had family. A second branch of Rostikovs resided within the city of Hecamet. Amrav Rostikov was cousin to Nabdina, and quite newly married. Since the dead woman had no children, this cousin would now inherit the title. Konrad's analytical brain lost no time in noting that point as a possible motive for the killing. Amrav Rostikov was not a secretive man, and Konrad had no difficulty gleaning all the relatively sparse information that was available about him. The new lord had already been wealthy before inheriting the Rostikov estate. That alone was interesting. If he had been involved in his cousin's death, then it had not been about money. Was he the sort to value the title itself highly enough to kill for it? Even if he was, that did not explain the peculiar note found in Nabdina's desk. Konrad frowned as he stepped from his carriage into the street outside the lesser Rostikov house, where Amrav still resided until after his cousin's funeral. The matter was already too complex. A simple explanation would not suffice. He rapped on the door with his silver-headed cane. It was answered by a manservant, somewhat less grand than the Rostikov butler, but hardly less exalted in attitude. "Lord Rostikov is not at home," the man informed him. Konrad sighed inwardly, disliking the sensation of repetition. "Where has his lordship gone?" he inquired. "I'm not at liberty to reveal that information," came the reply. "If you'd like to leave your card." Irksome, but very well. Konrad handed his visiting card to the officious manservant and walked away. At the end of the street he paused and closed his eyes. "Utapi," he murmured. "Utapi." On twin gusts of wind they came, leaving a pattern of frost on his skin as they twined about him. "Yes, Malykant." The new Lord Rostikov, he said to them silently. "Find him." He opened his eyes. The serpents, so vivid in his mind's eye, were barely discernible in the light of the weak winter sun. Mere puffs of smoke they seemed as they streamed away, scattering themselves on the wind. He waited, drawing his coat closer around himself to keep the cold out. It would not take them long to locate their quarry. A summons wormed its way into his thoughts. Utapi called him. He followed it on foot, ignoring the people he passed. His companions drew him to a small park a few streets away from the house, where several families were strolling the ornamental gardens or sitting on ironwork benches under the trees. Utapi guided his consciousness to the right group. A tall man wearing a tall top hat, walking arm in arm with a woman expensively dressed in wide, impractical skirts. Konrad stood back for a moment, watching as the man tilted his head to listen to something his pretty wife was saying. Konrad approached slowly, swinging his cane, ostensibly taking a stroll himself. When he collided with the lady, it was, of course, an accident. "My apologies," he said with a low bow, picking up the gloves the lady had dropped. She and her husband were both pale and dark-haired. She wore a fur coat and matching hat, very expensive, he noted. They certainly had not been short of money. Konrad looked for a moment at the gentleman, then affected a double-take. "Mr. Rostikov, is it not?" He bowed. Pardon me, I do of course mean Lord Rostikov." The lady smiled at his amendment, but Rostikov's face registered confusion. "Have we met?" "Once or twice, I believe, at some gathering or other. Not for some time. My name is Konrad Savast." He bowed again, and waited while understanding dawned in their eyes, and their manner became suddenly more welcoming. "Naturally we know of you, Mr. Savast," said the newly elevated lord, and even though he was a lord, he bowed rather low to Konrad in return. Konrad flashed a brief smile. He was no social leader, but he had a reputation for riches far greater than he really deserved. The Order of the Malykant had seen to that. The only social advantage greater than aristocratic blood was obscene wealth, and his certainly opened doors for him. "May I condole with you on your loss?" Konrad said politely. "Thank you, Mr. Savast." Rostikov glanced down at his clothes uncomfortably. Konrad understood. They were not wearing mourning clothes. But then they must have received the news only yesterday. There had not yet been time to assemble a wardrobe of suitably fashionable mourning attire. "And also I congratulate you on your good fortune," Konrad continued. The lady looked uncomfortable at this allusion, but her husband smiled. "Never thought it quite right, a woman holding the title like that. Not speaking ill of the dead, of course," he amended, as his wife frowned at him. "Of course not," Konrad said blandly, watching the reactions of both. He often wished that the serpents were as sensitive to the thoughts of others as they were to his. It would never be possible, of course. His mind had been bound to those of his companions by the Malykant himself, and he had been a consenting party to the business. He could hardly expect the overlord to perform this task on request upon any individual whom Konrad suspected of foul play, but it would make his task so much easier. Teeth nipped at his ankle, distracting him. He looked down to find a small but very pugnacious dog attached to his foot. "Oh, Peacat," sighed the lady, and bent gracefully to pick up the dog. It was an utterly repugnant creature, but she petted it as if it was a thing of extraordinary beauty. "I am sorry," she remembered to add. Konrad fixed the dog with a cold stare, not gracing its mistress's perfunctory apology with a reply. "Excuse me," he bowed as the dog began to whine. He left the park at a quick pace, his purpose accomplished. He had seen Amrav Rostikov and his wife. He had shown himself to them in friendship. When their next meeting came, He intended that it should be at their invitation. Konrad waited until the sun had set, and then he ventured out into the city on foot. He walked without hurry, his coat buttoned high on his throat against the chill of the night. Snowflakes drifted down out of the darkened skies, glowing eerily in the light of the gas lamps that illuminated the streets. Itapi and Utapi streamed along behind him, catching snowflakes in their insubstantial mouths and absorbing the frigid water. He was approaching the south gate, beyond which the bone forest spread. Lady Rostikova had met someone here not 3 days ago, and that someone had lured her out into the heart of the wetlands. This element of the mystery intrigued him. Why had it been necessary, or desirable, to conduct the killing so far outside the city? But now was not the time to investigate the killer's probable path. He bypassed the city gate and directed his steps instead towards a small shop that nestled beneath the city wall in the southeast sector. The position of this establishment was no accident. The owner was an apothecary, a poison master, and, on occasion, an alchemist. Like Konrad, she spent much of her time out in the wetlands. The shop was closed up at this hour, but Konrad was unfazed. He slipped around to the rear of the building and tapped on the door with his serpent-headed cane. No answer, but he could hear the apothecary muttering inside. He unlatched the door and went in. He took care to make at least a little noise, but still he remained unobserved. Irinanda was working. She stood over a workbench that rested in the center of the floor, her clothes covered by a grubby coat and her exquisite pale blonde hair tied into a loose bun. "Snake blood powder," she muttered, and a chittering patch of golden fur streaked away to the shelves that lined the walls. It leaped again, back to the tall bench that dominated the room. The monkey offered a small glass jar to the apothecary, who grabbed it, wrenched off the lid, and shook a quantity of dark red powder into a bubbling pot. She set the jar down, and the tiny monkey picked it up, replaced the lid, and leapt energetically back to the shelves. "Ash leaf," she said next, and the monkey brought her a phial containing the pale white dust of the ash leaf plant. "Quiet now," said the apothecary, and the monkey sat down on the bench, tucking its long tail around itself. Irinanda took a small measuring spoon from a pocket and dipped it into the neck of the phial. "1," she counted, dumping in a spoonful. "2." With each spoonful of dust, the liquid in her mixing pot bubbled higher and harder, threatening to explode out of its confines. "3." Konrad blinked. 3 measures of ash leaf? This would be a volatile potion. 4. Irinanda's head suddenly whipped around to stare at Konrad, who stood as still as he could in the shadow of the door. 4, she repeated, returning her attention to the pot. "That's 5, Konrad corrected. "You added 4 already." He could hear the frown in Irinanda's reply, even though the apothecary stood with her back to him. 4, she insisted, adding the 5th spoonful. She capped the phial and handed it off to the monkey. "Inkward," she instructed. The pot bubbled and foamed and began to spit. Konrad waited. The apothecary swore. "Down, Waverot!" The monkey instantly leapt off the bench and took refuge beneath it. The apothecary was not so fortunate. The pot exploded, and the contents spilled over the surface of her workstation and onto her coat. "Sorry," Konrad said. "I did try." Irinanda muttered something. She spent several minutes cleaning up the bench and the pot and the floor. Then she left the room. When she finally returned, she was wearing a clean coat, and most of the annoyance had gone from her face. "You're a liability, Konrad." "Marsh Spectre," he replied without preamble. Irinanda fixed her glorious but cold blue eyes on him. Her face was expressionless, but he didn't miss the gleam of avarice in her eyes. "Where?" was all she said. Already harvested, Konrad added. Damn you. Konrad leaned his cane against the door and took off his hat. Not by me, more is the pity. I think that an amateur was involved. He described the condition of the blossom, watching Irenanda's reactions as he spoke. She hardly moved. It wasn't me, she said when Konrad had finished. Of course it wasn't you, Konrad replied coolly. What I want to know is whether you've heard anything. Any new poisoners in the city? Any customers with too much interest in marsh spectre poison? Irenanda turned from him and began roaming around the room, briskly setting things to rights. Not recently, she said. Recently meaning? Not in the last few weeks. She collected a bowl of nuts from a cupboard and began feeding them to the monkey. All right, Konrad said, taking a seat on one of her uncomfortable high stools. How about before that? There was one man, Irenanda said, watching with rapt attention as the monkey devoured a walnut. 6 months or so ago, turned up after hours, asking for my inventory of virulent poisons. He wanted the painful sort. Konrad lifted his brows. Did he mention marsh spectre? No, I did. I told him it was the most suitable type for his requirements. Did he buy some? Would have, if I'd had any at the time. Maybe he went elsewhere. Irenanda shrugged. He might have, but I doubt he would have had any better luck. Wrong season. And I doubt he had the right paperwork. Konrad nodded. Nanda's business was legal, but she couldn't sell virulent poisons to anyone without a permit to trade in them. Did you tell him that? Of course. And you haven't seen him since? No. I wondered if he might come back when winter started, but he didn't. So he'd either found someone else to supply him with the poison, or he had gone in search of it himself. Konrad suspected the latter. A few months was plenty of time for him to learn about marsh spectre, how to find it, how to identify it, and how to harvest it. You didn't get a name, I suppose? Irenanda snorted. He as good as told me he was planning to kill someone. You think he'd leave a name? Konrad grunted. True. Damn him. Describe him for me. She turned back to Konrad at last and looked him full in the face. He's scrawny stock, she said. Black hair and eyes, dark skin. A lot like you, in fact. Konrad mulled that over. His coloring wasn't that rare. A number of people in Ekamet had a little bit of Iskani blood somewhere in their family tree, but it helped to narrow it down. Any other unusual sorts coming in for marsh spectre? Irenanda shook her head. I have some regulars, but they know what time of year to call. Regulars. He knew the sorts of people she spoke of. He dealt with them himself on occasion. Most of them were traders, taking the poisons to far countries where the symptoms wouldn't be so easily recognized, identified, and traced back to the source. Using marsh spectre on a prominent target within Ekamet's own wetlands was unwise, not something a professional was likely to do. He'd be willing to bet that this mysterious customer of Irenanda's had something to do with the death of Lady Rostikova. Thank you, he said, standing up and collecting his hat. He drew a pouch from the inside pocket of his coat and tossed it to the poison master by way of payment. Irenanda sniffed it, and her eyes widened. I got it. Generous. She tucked the pouch away quickly, as if fearing that he would change his mind. But when Konrad turned to leave, she spoke again. Is this about the dead aristocrat? Konrad turned around again, slowly, pondering his response. Why would she expect him to be investigating a murder? He'd wondered before whether Irenanda had guessed about his other identity. It wasn't the first time he had tapped her for information, and she was an intelligent woman. Yes, he said, simply, searching her face. She nodded. Do you think it's true that the Malykant is after the killer? Konrad thought of the rib bone that rested inside his coat, cleaned and sharpened and ready for use. "It must be," he said slowly. "Unless someone else in this city has a penchant for collecting ribs." Irananda looked him over as if wondering where he kept the bones. Konrad stood still, enduring her scrutiny without expression. But all she said was,
"Have you got any sunbane? I'm running low and I have an order to fill."
"I can spare a little." He had some in his coat pocket, in fact. He always carried it when he had a case to solve. It would make things much easier when he found the killer. But he allowed Irananda to take the little packet from him and empty out a little of the powder. When she handed back the packet, her fingers brushed his. It was the merest feather-light touch, but it felt, in a strange way, profound. Irananda's eyes closed for an instant. When she opened them again, her gaze had become speculative. "Thanks," she said. Konrad blinked. Was that it? He'd expected something different, though he wasn't sure what. Irananda's white teeth flashed in a sudden grin. Lifting a hand in farewell, she wandered out of the workroom. Her voice came floating back after she had passed beyond his sight.
"Lock up, will you? I don't want any more visitors tonight."
Konrad left without replying, his mind busy. He had no notion what had just happened, but that Irananda knew or suspected a few uncomfortable things about him was indubitable. That was an alarming thought. But then again, this was Irananda, his friend, or so he hoped. Would it be such a bad thing for her to know? The answer to that, he supposed, depended on what she planned to do with the information. Navdina's funeral took place the next day. Konrad attended, placing himself at the rear of the temple where he could watch the behavior of the other guests. The new Lord Rostikov and his lady sat in the first tier of seats. They were the only family Navdina had, but they did not choose to participate in the ceremony. Instead, Navdina Rostikova was given into the hands of the Malykant by priests, their faces hidden beneath the traditional spirit masks. Konrad bowed his head, murmuring the familiar words of devotion along with the congregation as Navdina's pyre was lit. The smell of smoke mingled with the thick fragrance of incense, the combination quickly turning acrid. He lifted his eyes to the open roof, watching as the smoke sailed into the sky. The service passed without interruption. There was no sign of the dark-skinned man that Irananda had mentioned. All those he saw with such coloring were people he recognized. People Irananda would probably recognize, too. Only one guest caught his attention, an elderly woman, her gray hair disordered and her dark mourning clothes hastily assembled. She showed far more emotion than anybody else in that gathering, stifling soft sobs in her handkerchief throughout the proceedings. He did not recognize her. He lingered afterwards as the surviving Rostikovs stationed themselves outside the temple doors. They received the condolences and thanks of the funeral guests with the utmost graciousness. Konrad shook the hands of his and her ladyship in his turn, watching their faces. They were both pale but composed, and perfectly courteous. His duty thus discharged, he retreated into the shadows cast by the setting winter's sun. Concealed within the portico of the building opposite the Malykant's temple, he watched until every funeral guest had offered their condolences and departed. The gray-haired woman was not among them. That confirmed one of his suppositions. Her shabby clothes proclaimed her to be a servant, and this omission offered further evidence of her station. She did not emerge at all, in fact, and he guessed that she had been obliged to use the lesser entrance at the rear of the temple. It was unusual for servants to be permitted at the funeral of so high-ranking a person. Why had she been present? And who was she? Only when the Rostikovs had also departed did he move from his hiding place. He crossed to the now deserted temple and sat in the tall tiers at the back. He fixed his gaze on the faintly smoldering remains of Navdina's pyre. He spent most of the night there, savoring the chilling presence of his master, the Malikt, and thinking. Chapter 4. The new Lady Rostikova had been quick to furnish herself with visiting cards. A fresh one lay on his hall table when he returned the following morning. It was a prim little rectangle of card, printed with her new title and her address in gilded lettering. The address in question was Rostikov House, already given into new hands. The lady had left a note for him along with the card, and an elegant invitation scribed in gold ink. She was returning his visit, she said, and would he do them the honor of attending their little gathering on the 13th? The invitation was no surprise. He'd known it would come, as soon as he had introduced himself to them at the park. His acquaintance was worth having to a newly aristocratic couple, anxious to establish themselves in their new position. And in keeping with that wish, the opulence of the invitation told him this event would be no little gathering. They were flaunting their new status, proving their suitability for the highest echelon of Achamet society. He knew that few people would blame them for it. They weren't wasting any time, either. The 13th was just 2 days away. They were gambling on their terrific rise in status to bring guests at such short notice. It was a gambit that would probably work. Konrad wrote his reply immediately and handed it to a servant to deliver. In one respect, this news was disconcerting. If Rostikov House had already been claimed by its new owners, they would have stripped it out. No further clues as to its former mistress's fate were likely to be found there, but his most promising leads were people: the poison-seeking man whom Irananda had described, and the old woman at the funeral. It seemed indubitable that the woman was connected to Navdina in some way, closely connected given her distress. It was quite possible that she herself still resided at Rostikov House, at least for the present, and the upcoming party would give the perfect opportunity to look for her. He rang the bell. Within moments, footsteps approached, and Mrs. Orista, his housekeeper, bustled in and bobbed a curtsy. "I'm expecting someone," he told her. "Make sure he is shown into the parlor as soon as he arrives. Without delay, please. And send someone in with tea and something edible." "Of course, sir," she smiled. The woman was always beaming, and left in the direction of the kitchen. Nuratov arrived as the clock struck 11. He was always punctual, thought Konrad approvingly as he rose to greet him. 10 minutes only, the man said to Konrad as they shook hands. He perched on the edge of a chair, not even pausing to remove his coat and hat. "Barris has me jumping this morning." Barris was Artoni Barris, chief of Achamet's police, and Nuratov was one of his inspectors. Konrad paid him to share findings with him. Sometimes he paid in money. Sometimes he paid in information. Nuratov knew him only as a somewhat eccentric amateur sleuth. "Rostikov case, I'm guessing?" Nuratov accepted a cup of tea and drank half of it down in one gulp. Konrad lifted a brow. "It's the big one at the moment," Nuratov explained. "Everyone's talking about it. Thought it would be up your street." "Do you have anything for me?" Konrad selected a cake and began delicately pulling it to pieces. Nuratov nodded emphatically. "The victim's servants have been talking. Said Navdina went all to pieces a few weeks ago. Cancelled all her social engagements and started spending all her time locked up in the house." Konrad leaned forward. "Does anyone know why?" Nuratov produced a piece of paper from a pocket and thrust it at Konrad. It was a transcript of the note he had already seen. "We think there were more," Nuratov said as Konrad pretended to read the page. "Footman says he saw the lady throw a note into the fire once. She was upset, and the butler told us she used to tremble whenever the post was delivered." Konrad frowned. The destroyed note doubtless contained the missing information, such as what precisely she had been accused of. Why had she destroyed those and kept this one? "This meeting," he said, tapping one of the notes, "at the south gate. Did she go?" Narratov refilled his teacup and drank that down, too. "Apparently not. Instead, she locked everything up, barricaded herself inside the house. But a maid heard voices in her room around midnight, her mistress's and someone else's. Another woman, she thinks. There was no sign of how she got into the house." A woman? Konrad would have expected it to be Hernanda's unidentified customer, if anyone. So now he had two people involved. Did anyone see this mysterious visitor? "No, everything was quiet again at 1 when the maid went to bed." Nobody was surprised to find her absent in the morning? They were, but they'd assumed she'd gone out. The front door was unbarred on the inside. So nobody had wondered where she was. No one had raised the alarm, not even under such unusual circumstances as these. Poor Nabdina. "Anything else?" he asked Narratov. The inspector shook his head, hastily swallowing a mouthful of cake. "That's it. Maybe more later." Konrad nodded and stood up. "Thank you," he said. "You'd better go, but I have a tip for you before you do." He gave the inspector Irananda's name and the address of her shop. He wasn't afraid of the consequences. Her poisons trade was perfectly legal. "Ask her about Marsh Spectre," he finished. Nuratov's brows rose. "Is she involved?" "Doubtful, but she has information that may be relevant." Nuratov grinned. "You should join the force. I know you don't need the work, but we could use you." Konrad shook his head. "I prefer to work alone." When Konrad returned to Rostikov House for the party, he hardly recognized it. Gone were Navdina's collections of ornaments, the gilded trinkets and the clutter. In their places stood expensive antiques and pieces of new art. And books of the sort to be looked at rather than read. The effect was much more tasteful, though it lacked character to Konrad's eye. He could have walked into the home of any aristocrat in Ekemet and seen examples of the same kinds of things. The affair was, of course, splendid. Everything about the party dripped money, from the clothes of his hosts and fellow guests to the food laid out in the dining room. Lord Rostikov and his lady sparkled with pleasure and affability as they greeted their guests, but he paid them only the briefest of courtesies before moving on. It was not the hosts he was interested in speaking to this evening. He was looking for the shabbily dressed servant, the one who had wept so hard at Nabdina's funeral. She wouldn't be among the party guests. Her prim black drabness and grey hair would not fit among the sparkling birds of paradise that flocked through Nabdina's hall, dining room, and ballroom. But perhaps she was somewhere else in the house. He paused a moment longer where he was, watching the revelry. He kept his disgust hidden behind his mask of stone indifference, the face that nobody knew how to read. They had no respect for the dead, these preening gentry. They swarmed over her house, dripping in silks and jewels, laughing and courting one another's favor. Their faces smiling, but their eyes calculating and hard. They would have danced on Nabdina's own grave with as much abandon. Konrad endured the fawning attention of his hosts with cool indifference. He was obliged to endure still more as every one of the Rostikovs' friends was brought forward to be introduced. When at last they let him alone, repelled and puzzled by his blank countenance and bland manner, he allowed himself to meld into the milling crowd and made his slow way towards the stairs. He slipped up one flight and then two, welcoming the gradual cessation of the brittle chatter and laughter of the party. He paused briefly on the second story, thinking again about the weeping woman. It was likely that she had been Nabdina's servant, inherited along with the house. The new mistress would have brought all her own staff with her when she moved in. Where might she have placed an unwanted extra? Further up, he decided. The attic. He climbed to the top story and began opening doors. They were all empty, their owners busy serving at, or cooking for, the party that proceeded at a busy hum some way below. At the back of the house he found a small, mean room, smaller than all the others. It was barely more than a cupboard. On the narrow, hard bed sat the woman he sought, so still that Konrad wondered if she was asleep. Then, slowly, her head turned and her eyes focused on him. He stared at her for a moment, contemplating her features. She was younger than he had thought. Her hair was gray, but her face was relatively unlined, and there was no frailty about her figure. Konrad guessed her to be in her 50s. "I saw you at the funeral," he said. "I wanted to speak with you." A faint flicker of interest registered in her blue eyes. "Who are you?" "A friend of Lady Rostikova." He watched in silence as her face crumpled and she began to sob. "And that's why I wanted to speak to you," he added, "because of the way you cried at her funeral." A single hard chair rested next to the bed. He took it, passing her his handkerchief as he did so.
"It's as though she was never here,"
said the woman at last.
"They dance and dance in her house, drinking and carousing like they've already forgotten her."
She began twisting his handkerchief in her hands, binding it into a tight knot.
"Every little piece of her life has been stripped out of this house, thrown away like it was rubbish. She did that the minute she set foot in here."
"Who are you?" Konrad asked. The woman sighed deeply.
"Etreya Rodova. I was Navi's nurse. I knew her from the day she was born."
"You were very attached to her."
"She was a sweet child,"
Etreya said with a wobbly smile.
"And she grew up to be a fine lady. Not stuck up like some of those others you meet."
Her lips were quivering again.
"I should have done better for her, protected her somehow."
"From what?" Konrad kept his voice low and his posture still. He wanted her to forget he was there, to keep on talking.
"I was almost a mother to her,"
said Etreya tearfully, without answering his question.
"It's a mother's job to protect their child."
"What of her own mother?"
"Died,"
she said.
"She was never well after the birth, only a few weeks after Navi was born. She was gone."
"And you've been part of her household ever since?" She nodded, eyes glittering.
"She said she couldn't part with me. I was to be nurse to her own children whenever she married."
"And now?"
"I've been given notice."
Twist, twist went her hands with the handkerchief.
"She needn't have bothered. I had no intention of staying."
"I take it by she you mean Lady Rostikova?" Etreya pulled a face of disgust.
"They didn't get on," she said. "It doesn't seem right that she's here, taking over Navi's space after
someone had stabbed her to the heart with a poisoned blade and left her to die alone in the middle of the bone forest. Well, indeed. Konrad watched her, thinking. She had so much to say about the Rostikov family, but she'd skirted the topic of the murder. She was obviously heartbroken by Navdina's death, but in like circumstances, most people asked questions. Why her? Why us? Why did this have to happen? Etreya hadn't asked any of those things. "Ms. Morodeva," he said slowly, "do you know why Navdina was murdered?" Etreya's tears stopped. She looked back at him, and he detected a trace of fear in her cool blue eyes. Fear and something like guilt.
"Of course not,"
she said. Now she looked at him with suspicion.
"Who are you, really? Why do you ask these questions of me?"
Her defensiveness was interesting. He made a note of it. "Just a friend," he said, standing. "Thank you, Ms. Marudeva." He left the room, quietly closing the door behind him. Several things about her manner interested him, but the most pressing question in his mind was the reason for the nurse's tears. Was it grief that had made her weep so at the funeral? Or was it remorse? Chapter 5. "I want to see you." The note said nothing else, and it was not signed, but Konrad knew who had sent it. The fog still hadn't lifted, and the trees were dripping wet when he stepped beyond the city gates into the marshlands. Beads of dew twinkled on the branches, and half-frozen water sloshed and splintered underfoot, eerily loud in the hush. He strode through the hazy atmosphere, sure of his path, unconcerned by the fact that he could see only a few handspans in front of him. The serpents glided into position on either side of him, coalescing out of the mist like puffs of steam. "Be gone," he told them silently. "I go where you must not follow." "You go to meet the apothecary," said Itapi. "You think she does not know?" said Utapi. "She might guess," he conceded, "but I do not wish for her suspicions to be confirmed." Itapi flicked her tail derisively and vanished. But Utapi lay around his neck like a scarf, and would not be moved until Konrad had almost reached the house on stilts in the woods. "Go," he urged, and Utapi melded back into the fog. Irananda was already inside when he emerged through the trap-door in the floor. She was cleaning, dusting, and organizing the bottles and jars on his shelves. She knew he had arrived. He read it in the way she turned her body to avoid appearing to notice him. He smiled inwardly and sat down on his makeshift bed, waiting for her to finish. "This place could be so pleasant," she said at last, still without looking at him. He shrugged. "Why would I keep it tidier? The mice and the birds and the insects will still find their way in to put all my preparations in disarray. And this space is not intended for entertaining." She sniffed. "I dislike your city house. I dislike you when you are in the city. You become an insufferable prig." He smiled openly. "Because I wear a nice coat and a top hat? You like me better in these things, perhaps?" He glanced down at the waxed greatcoat he wore, the tall boots splashed with mud, the trousers and the shirt of thick, unpretending cotton. "Yes," she said firmly. "You're more real." "Are you saying that Mr. Konrad Savast of Bakar House is fake?" "Quite fake," she said, turning a severe gaze upon him. "You've better things to do than to hobnob with the social butterflies." "Some of them are quite amusing." She frowned at that and turned away again, removing an imaginary speck of dust from a nearby jar with the cuff of her coat sleeve. "I tease, Nanda. I assure you the social butterflies are as much in my poor graces as they are in yours today." "He came back," she said, abruptly spinning around. He sat up, alert. "Who?" "The poison man. The one looking for Marsh Spectre." He patted the seat beside him. "Come here and tell me everything." Irananda folded her arms and remained where she was. "He came in yesterday. He tried to flirt with me." Her indignation made him want to laugh. He stifled it. She didn't like to be laughed at. "I suppose he liked you," he said mildly. "It's not impossible that people might, once in a while." She narrowed her eyes. "If he hasn't already committed murder, he's planning to. He makes me sick." Konrad sighed inwardly. He agreed with her about this person, but she tended to say similar things about everyone, no matter how minor their crime. "Just tell me what happened." "I thought he'd come back for the Marsh Spectre, but he didn't say anything about that. He was looking for a slow-acting poison this time, something that would take a few days to kill a person. And he wants it to look natural." That's an interesting change of direction, he mused. 2 possibilities occurred to him at once. Either the poison man, as Nanda called him, was a killer for hire and had moved on to another assignment, or he was still involved in the Rostikov case. If the latter, his new target must be related in some way to Navdina's death. What did you tell him? She donned her most evil smile, an expression that always made him shiver a little.
I gave him Maricus.
Oh? But he might have educated himself since the last time you spoke to him. He may know what Maricus is. Her smile became scornful.
Naturally, I told him it was root. When powdered, they are similar enough to fool anyone who is not an expert like myself.
He nodded sagely, and her smile turned cat-like with satisfaction. She had been clever indeed. Root was a poison of the type the man was looking for. When ingested by its victims, it caused a sickness that lasted for 3 or 4 days. The symptoms were similar to a number of common ailments, so its use was rarely detected. Maricus, on the other hand, was not fatal. When ingested, it caused a violent rash, uncomfortable but not particularly dangerous to the victim. Said rash was also nice and visible. You are perfectly amazing today, he smiled. He was really grateful. If her mysterious customer was still involved with Navdina's case, she might have given him a strong lead. Instead of returning his smile, Irananda stared at him, her expression hostile. What do you do with your time? He blinked. What? She gestured at the pungent room with its crowded shelves and general lack of furniture. What is this for? Why do you need it if you're a gentleman of Akemet? Why does a gentleman of Akemet involve himself in the poison and herb trade? How in the world does it make sense to waste half your time going to parties and spend the other half solving murders? I don't often go to parties. You went to one the other night. His eyes narrowed. Have you been watching me? She lifted her chin, undaunted. I hear things. He stood up. She wasn't a short woman by any means, but he was quite a bit taller. He stepped closer, forcing her to look a long way up into his face. Stop hearing things, he said quietly. My business is my own, and none of yours. She stared back at him, her pale blue eyes wintry. You keep things from me. And why shouldn't I? Who are you to demand my secrets? So you admit that you have some? Answer my question. She drew herself up, a futile gesture in the face of his superior height. I'm your friend, she said coldly. Unless I'm much mistaken, I am your only friend. It isn't right that you keep important things from me. He stepped back and gestured invitingly at the trapdoor. Thank you for your information. She shot him a look of hatred. Tell me if anything comes of it, if it isn't too much trouble. He inclined his head and opened the trapdoor, holding it while she made her way down the ladder in a few long, graceful movements, and disappeared. He closed the door again and returned to his seat on the bed. Nanda was difficult when she got hold of an idea. How far would she carry her suspicions? Part of him wanted to tell her. She was right. He had few real friends, and there was nobody in whom he could confide about his life as the Malykant. It could be lonely, but a larger part of him had no intention of telling her. Solving the murder was only part of his job. The other part was much worse. Would she understand, or would she despise him, too? He couldn't risk it, because without Nanda's friendship, he really would have nobody at all. Malykant, the sibilant voice whispered through his dreams, drawing him towards consciousness. He opened his eyes to complete darkness, or near complete. A hazy phantom hovered near his face, pale and faintly glowing. Itapi, he murmured. What's afoot? Death is on the wind, the serpent replied. Konrad was out of bed in an instant, groping blindly for his clothes. It took him a few moments to dress, and then he was down the stairs and out into the street, Itapi gliding ahead of him and Utapi trailing behind. The night was cold and very, very dark. The sky was free of clouds and empty of moonglow, for the moon was in its dark phase. Stars glittered coldly above as Konrad hurried through the streets of Ekamet, fumbling with the buttons of his coat to fasten the wool closer around his chilled throat. The city was silent and empty at this hour, and his footsteps rang in the quiet. Itapi was leading him northwards through the city, past the center and into the richest quarter. A premonition twisted his gut as he realized where they were headed, directly, unerringly, towards Rostikov House. Had Irananda's gambit failed? Had the poison man succeeded after all? "Death is within," Itapi whispered as they stopped outside the front door of the house. The building loomed, dark and imposing and firmly shut against the world. He slipped around to the back. Nothing stirred. All was undisturbed, as far as he could tell in the darkness. A servant's entrance stood at the rear of the house, a sturdy wooden door with a small window and, he doubted not, strong bolts on the inside. He brushed his fingers against the lock. The metal grew chilled under his touch, and he heard the faint sound of the well-oiled lock pulling back, clicking open. Another moment, and a faint squeak of metal told him the bolt had withdrawn itself also. Konrad opened the door just wide enough to pass through. He stepped into a small rear kitchen, a utility area that was, thankfully, empty of inhabitants. "Itapi," he said in the silent way, "lead me." The serpent materialized in his mind's eye, keeping its semi-corporeal form hidden. He followed her lead out of the tiny room, through the main kitchen in which a single maid snored, and through at last into the more opulent parts of the house. Itapi stopped at last outside the study. The door was ajar, and a light burned within. "Is there danger?" He felt the serpent's negative. "No living soul is within," she confirmed. "There is only death." He pushed open the door, slowly so it wouldn't creak, and stepped inside. The corpse lay near the window. It was partially hidden behind a wing-back chair that sat near the fireplace, so Konrad couldn't see the face. But the clothes told him this was a man and not a servant. He crossed the room in swift strides and knelt by the side of the body. With a shock, he recognized Lord Amrav Rostikov. He lay on his back, hatless and without his cravat or waistcoat. He wore only a loose shirt and trousers. His throat had been cut. "Serpents," he said immediately, "bind his soul." They did so, weaving the scattered shreds of it together and binding it to the corpse with the strength of their master's will. Rostikov's mouth opened, and his eyes widened in shock. Or was it fear? "Tell me what happened," Konrad ordered, pitching his voice low. "Quietly." The corpse's mouth worked, but nothing emerged. "Who killed you?" Konrad said. Rostikov grunted, and his arms flailed. "Who killed you?" Konrad repeated. "Tell me quickly." The corpse grunted again, an inarticulate, urgent sound. He shivered, and tears leaked out of his eyes. Suddenly understanding, Konrad knelt and pried the man's lips apart. The corpse's tongue was missing. He sighed. "Release him," he ordered the serpents. They obeyed, and Lord Rostikov's corpse settled back into the stillness of true death. Konrad retrieved his knife, working quickly. He'd already been in the house for too long. He cut into the corpse's torso, opened it, and carved away the flesh that coated his ribs. He chose one of the sturdiest of the rib bones and extracted it, wrapping it in cloth and storing it in his coat. This done, he paused to examine the room. Everything appeared to be in order, nothing was broken or upset, and the room did not appear to have been robbed. He did not find the weapon that had been used to cut Rostikov's throat. He left the room, leaving the door ajar as he'd found it. He strode back through the house, past the maid that snored, beautifully oblivious in her place by the cold kitchen fire, and back out of the rear door. The locks and bolts slid smoothly shut again at his bidding, and silence returned to the Rostikov dwelling. He could think of only one reason why the killer would remove Lord Rostikov's tongue after he was dead. That the culprit knew he was hunted by the Malykant was no surprise. Everyone knew what the missing rib bones meant. But the specifics of his method were not and should not be known. Someone knew about his reanimation of Navdina Rostikova. Someone knew that corpses could still speak were they encouraged by the right means. And that person had taken steps to ensure that Amrav Rostikov could not identify his killer. What worried him most was how. Had the killer researched the role of Malykant and found someone who could give detailed information? He doubted that. Such details were secret, protected on pain of death. Merely to find such a person would be difficult. Encouraging them to share their knowledge would be virtually impossible. That meant that he had possibly, probably even, been observed when he spoke with Navdina's corpse, and that in turn meant that he might have been identified. He'd been wearing his customary wide-brimmed hat, he knew. It was cold out in the bones at this time of year, so he had been wearing a thick coat and scarf. His hands had been gloved. He doubted that much of his face had been visible as he had worked on Navdina's corpse, but nonetheless, he would have to be more careful. Utapi, he said in his mind. Utapi. Watchers. You are my eyes in the spirit lands. Was any living soul present at the binding of Navdina Rostikova? We think not, Utapi replied. But it is not impossible, Utapi added. He understood. They had bound the spirit of Navdina and held it while he questioned her. While thus occupied, they could not simultaneously keep watch over him. He made his way down to the small park near to his house and sat down on a bench, drawing his hat down over his eyes. Dawn would not be long in coming, and sleep was out of the question for him now. It was difficult to imagine what the consequences might be of his exposure as the Malykant. He doubted not that his ability to perform the role would be compromised. Therein lay the logic in keeping the title a secret. In order to move about unobserved, he must be anonymous. And for the Malykant to be feared, as was proper, his identity must be a mystery. But if he had been identified, the killer had known who he was for days and had not yet chosen to expose him. Perhaps he was yet safe. But he had been careless at the scene of Navdina's death. He must take much greater care from now on. Konrad returned to Rostikov House a few hours later, as soon as he judged that the alarm would have been raised. He arrived to find the house crawling with activity, policemen moving in and out of the front door, taking tools inside and removing evidence, reporters hoping to catch a word with the detective, servants fleeing the house in a panic. Konrad hung back. A day or two ago he might have gone inside with impunity, but now he was reluctant to draw attention to himself. He waited until he saw a familiar figure emerge from the house, his dark blue overcoat closely buttoned up and his inspector's hat tall on his head. Konrad fell into step beside Narrated as the man made his way around the side of the house. "Savast," Narrated greeted him. "I imagine you already know the identity of the victim?" Konrad inclined his head. "What have you learned?" "Victim's tongue was removed," he replied. "No indication as to why. Throat was slit, ragged job. Not a professional killing by any stretch of the imagination. Ground floor window was open. We think the killer got in that way." Konrad's brows went up. "A ground floor window? In which room?" "Parlor," Narrated said, with a sideways glance at him. "Does that mean anything to you?" Konrad said nothing. There had been no ground floor windows open a few hours ago, but he was not inclined to admit to a police inspector that he had been inside that house last night. "Is anyone ill?" he asked instead. Narrated looked at him oddly. "Ill how?" "Suffering, say, from a variety of rash? Not that I know of. But we haven't finished interviewing everyone yet. Why do you ask? Got some kind of lead?" Konrad smiled. "This one I cannot share. But note this. If anyone inside that house should develop any such ailment in the near future, it is significant, and you'll let me know if it happens." "All right." Konrad could hear the exasperation in the inspector's voice, but he was unconcerned. He'd done his duty in alerting the man. The details could be spared. He didn't want Irananda's name to come up again. "Keep an eye on it," Konrad said. With a nod to Narrated, he departed. Chapter 6. Two sharpened rib bones now rested in Konrad's inner coat pocket. He hoped fervently that he would not have to add a third. He had retired to the Malik's temple, as he often did when the leads on a mystery ran dry, and he was unsure where to turn for answers. The peace in this place was soothing. It calmed the furious whirl of his thoughts and cleared his mind, the better to see the patterns that lay beneath the confused assortment of clues he had collected. Sometimes he felt the Malik's presence brush against his mind, as cold and merciless as winter itself. The Overlord had granted Konrad considerable privileges in exchange for his services, and he expected swift results. In his years as the Malykant, he had never yet failed his master. What the consequences of that might be he did not know, but the mere prospect was enough to set his heart beating quick and hard with fear. Such a rush of feeling was rare for him. Emotion was an impediment to the calm clarity of mind he needed in order to carry out his duties. All his duties. And so when he had become the Malykant, his new master had taken it all. Konrad had felt some core part of his soul wrenched away and scattered to the winds. And since then, where his emotions should have been, he felt only emptiness, and a faint echo of the feelings he might otherwise have had. The only exception was his reaction to the Spirit Lord himself. Determined to retain the loyal service of his chief disciple, the Malik had left Konrad's fear of him intact. A pleasant gift, Konrad thought, as his bound soul shivered under the eye of his master. He forced himself to take slow, deep breaths, drawing his usual calm around himself until his heartbeat slowed and his mind cleared. Think, Konrad. He had uncovered many pieces of this puzzle, and they would fit together somehow. Lord Amrav Rostikov. Konrad had been inclining towards him as a suspect. After all, he stood to gain the most from Navdina's death. But now he too lay dead and cold, and he had been prevented from speaking of his murder. Two Rostikovs. He discarded the idea that Navdina's fate might have been intended for another. Might Irananda's poison man hold some manner of grudge against the family? He knew of no particular crime the Rostikovs had committed, but perhaps something lay hidden behind their respectable facade. If that was the case, then Rostikov's young wife might be in danger. Perhaps not. She had been in the house when her husband was killed, yet she had been spared. Did that mean she was exempted from whatever curse dogged the rest of her family? Or had she been more directly involved? Then there was the nurse, Itreya Morodova. Perhaps she knew something of it. Her manner was not as he would expect from a woman in her position. He would speak to her again, and today. If she had any information, she would tell him. His skin prickled with the awareness that he was being watched. Raising his head, he saw a dark figure sitting midway up the tiers across from him. A woman by her shape and posture. The brim of her hat shaded her face, but he could see her mouth. She was smirking at him. "Nanda," he said softly, knowing she would hear him. "You are following me." She stood up and made her way around to his seat.
"You are paranoid," she replied with a wicked smile. "I came to pay my respects to his greatness, and I find you shivering with cold and fear under the eye of the Malikt. What can it mean?"
Konrad snorted. "If you may pay your respects to his greatness, why mayn't I do so with equal innocence?"
"And the reason for your fear?"
"I was cold."
"Cold? I think not."
Konrad said nothing.
"Well," she said, shaking her head, "I have shopping to do."
She turned away. He might have expected her to be angry. She frequently was, with him. But her manner struck him as sad, and that bit at his heart. He watched, undecided, as she picked her way back down the tiers to the ground and left the temple. He went after her. "Nanda, wait." He didn't have to run far. She stood outside the main door of the temple, hands folded, obviously expecting him. He glowered at her in faint annoyance. She was far too good at manipulating him, for no reason he could imagine. Now he noticed that her little gold-furred monkey traveled inside her cloak. The damned creature's expression mirrored hers. Smug.
"Yes, Konrad,"
said Irananda, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Are you just paying a plague, or are you inclined to help?" She lifted her chin.
"Help with what?"
"Solve the murder. No, I am not going to tell you why, so don't ask." She grinned outright at that.
"I'll help."
"Then find the poison man." She gave a little mock bow, her hand over her heart.
"Yes, my liege, as you command."
"This is not a game, Nanda. Take some care." Nanda nodded seriously.
"I know. See you soon."
She wandered off, disappearing into the evening shadows. Konrad watched her go, hoping he hadn't made a colossal mistake. But he had the feeling that Nanda could handle herself very well indeed. As he finally turned to leave, movement flickered at the edges of his vision. Several figures were hurrying up the street on their way to one of the several temples that waited there. Their movements were brisk and hurried. None of them looked at him. This was expected. The movement that had caught his attention had been a stealthy one, the suggestion of a dark figure just slipping out of sight. His senses prickled. He was being watched, he would swear to it. "Serpents," he called silently. He relayed to them the glimpse he'd had of his pursuer, and they darted away. Unwilling to appear suspicious, he began the walk back to his home, his pace slow. It wasn't hard to appear lost in thought. Why would somebody be following him? His mind flew back to Amrav Rostikov's missing tongue. Somebody knew his methods. Perhaps they had identified him as well. That thought was a chilling one. If it was so, what was the intended purpose behind having him shadowed? Was the pursuer gathering information with a view to exposing Konrad's identity? Or was it worse still? The serpent shades were back, twining their glacial spirits around his soul.
"No one is there, Malykant."
Far from reassuring him, this news only deepened his concern. He had learned to trust his senses over the years. That somebody was following him, he had no doubt, but that person was apparently adept enough to evade his serpents. That suggested two things. One, he or she knew about Etopi, and Utopi too. And two, whoever was on his trail was no amateur. Most likely a hire, then, and a professional. But a professional what? Investigator? Or assassin? A day later, the investigation at the Rostikov house was mostly over. The crowds of reporters were gone, and Konrad passed only a single solitary policeman on his way in. That suited his purposes well. He gave his card to the butler and waited. Annalina Rostikov was in mourning for her husband, but still he thought she would agree to see him. He'd gone to considerable trouble to arrive here undetected, though he had made it home yesterday without incident, He had been awake and on edge all night, expecting some manner of confrontation or attack. None had yet come, but he remained vigilant. The butler returned. "Her ladyship is at home," he said. "Thank you." Konrad followed the servant upstairs and into the drawing-room. As the butler discreetly withdrew, Konrad studied the new widow. She was sitting bolt upright on an uncomfortably hard divan. Her morning attire was impeccable, but she looked tired, and her face was drawn and white. He recognized the signs of agitation in her posture and the way her hands fidgeted restlessly with the trimmings of her gown. He felt a stab of sympathy for the woman. She couldn't be more than 25 or so, he guessed, much the same age that Nadina had been. She was shocked, upset, and afraid. He read that in her. "Lady Rostikova," he murmured, offering a bow. "Forgive my intrusion. I wish to convey my condolences and also to offer my services to you." "Your services?" She looked at him without much interest, her eyes dull with tiredness. "If there is anything I may do for you, you only have to name it." She said nothing for a moment. Her gaze dropped into her lap, and she swallowed hard, blinking. "Are you some kind of private investigator?" she inquired, fixing her cool blue eyes on him again. "An interesting guess, my lady. Why should you suppose it?" "I met you for the first time after Lady Nadina's death. You went looking for us deliberately, I suppose, and you were here again yesterday." Konrad blinked. He hadn't entered the house yesterday, at least not after his midnight visit. Could she possibly know about that? "I saw you from the window," she added. "Out there." She gestured vaguely. He bowed. "I suppose I am an amateur investigator of sorts." Her eyes narrowed. "It is a strange profession for a gentleman to undertake." He shrugged, unwilling to be goaded. "Even a gentleman must have something to do with his time." "Most gentlemen find they can occupy themselves perfectly well without surrounding themselves with murders, thefts, and criminals." "It is an interest of mine," Konrad replied coolly, "and I have an aptitude for the work." "Very well, Mr. Savast. As unusual a specimen as you may be, if you can solve this mystery, I shall be profoundly grateful to you. As long as the truth remains hidden, I exist in fear of my life." "And you think yourself a target?" She lifted one elegant shoulder in a shrug. "What else am I to think? Until recently there were but 3 of us bearing the Rostikov name. Now I am the only one remaining. I cannot help but imagine that I may also be at risk." "But you saw nothing 2 nights ago? You heard nothing?" She shook her head. "Nothing. But I am not a light sleeper. Perhaps if I had been, then poor Amrav might not have died." She pursed her lips tightly together, mastering herself quickly. Konrad watched silently. "Why was your husband in his study at that time of night? Did he retire as normal?" "Amrav liked to read late. He was often in his study until the early hours of the morning. That night was no different. I retired before midnight, but he did not come to bed before I fell asleep." "Do you know of anyone who might have wanted to hurt your husband?" She bit her lip, her eyes filling with tears as she shook her head. "He had many friends, but he was wealthy, and he had a high position in Ekamet. Perhaps jealousy?" Konrad leapt on that. Was there anyone in particular who was jealous of him? "No, nobody that I know of." Konrad sighed, frustrated. He was out of questions, and she had given him nothing useful. "There is one particular servant under your roof with whom I'd like to speak further. Her name is Morodova." Was it his imagination, or did she stiffen at those words? Her posture was already so rigid that it was difficult to be sure. "The nurse? Why would you be interested in her?" "There's no cause for alarm," Konrad replied calmly. She knew Navdina very well, and I believe she may be able to offer some useful information if she was properly persuaded. Her ladyship lifted one delicate brow.
Properly persuaded?
I believe she was suspicious of my questions when I spoke to her before. Perhaps if her employer were to encourage her to be open with me? Her face was very cold. She knew something about Etreya, he felt sure. But would she share it with him?
I would be delighted to be of use, Lady Rostikova was saying. But unfortunately, Miss Morodova is unwell, and I do not think she should be disturbed at present.
Konrad felt a thrill at those words. Unwell? I'm sorry to hear it. Is her indisposition grave? Perhaps I may be able to speak with her tomorrow.
She shook her head decisively. I doubt that very much. She is quite unwell and confined to her bed.
Konrad hoped for more. Some mention of her symptoms would be an enormous help to him. But her ladyship said nothing more, and he didn't wish to give himself away by probing further. He merely nodded. Perhaps I might be informed when she recovers, he said.
Certainly, and in turn, you will let me know if you uncover anything relevant.
It was not a question. Of course, he replied. Naturally, he would not. He never shared details of a case with anybody who was involved. She nodded and rang the bell. The butler reappeared.
Please show Mr. Savast out, said the lady coolly.
Konrad waited until he and the manservant had reached the hall before he asked his next question. I'm sorry to hear of Miss Morodova's indisposition, he said as the butler opened the door for him. May I ask the cause of her illness?
A fever of some kind, the man replied. Most uncomfortable. A shame, for she is a good woman.
Uncomfortable? The man nodded, his face pale.
Her skin burns red and itches. She claws at herself.
My best wishes for her recovery, Konrad said, hiding the chill he felt. As the door to the great house closed behind him, he stood for a moment in thought. Etreya Morodova had been the target of the poison Arenanda had given to her so-called poison man, and he had administered it in the belief that it would kill. Presumably he was still expecting her to die of her affliction. The butler certainly seemed to believe that she would. But Arenanda had said that it was not fatal. Sooner or later her would-be murderer would realize that too, and try something else. He went straight to the police station and asked for Narrated. The inspector was not available. Get this to him, please, Konrad said, scrawling a note on a piece of paper. He folded it up and handed it across to the officer manning the desk. It's urgent. Etreya Morodova is the next target, read the note. She must be placed under guard. If possible, she should be removed from the Rostikov house. His own task was a difficult one. What connection did Etreya have to this case? Was she an accomplice, now being eliminated for what she knew? Or was it knowledge alone that made a target of her? He'd received the impression before that she knew more than she'd said about Navdina's death. Somebody wished to remove her, and it was intended to be the sort of death that would raise no suspicion. Perhaps that was so that she could not speak any further to people such as himself. He would have to find a way to see her, and hope she remained lucid enough to speak with him. And that meant another midnight visit to Rostikov house. This time, though, would be much more difficult, for the house was on its guard against intruders, and there remained the matter of his unknown pursuer, just to make life particularly complicated. Konrad sighed. There would be no sleep for him tonight, either. Chapter 7. Arenanda Folenya stayed in her shop until long after nightfall. The streets would be quiet. Few people would be around to see her walking with her eyes half closed, following a trail that nobody could see but her. She'd found a reason to touch the poison man when he'd come to her shop before. Not much, and not for long. A mere brush of her fingers against his as she gave him the phial with the supposed tiger root. In doing so, she had gained a glimpse of his thoughts. Scant, but perhaps it would be enough. An assortment of images had passed behind her eyes, flashing by so fast she had barely time to draw meaning from them. She'd seen the bare trees of the forests outside of Ekamet, shrouded in mist. She'd seen a house, huddled low to the ground like a frightened animal. She'd seen a strip of braided, multicolored cloth with a tiny brass bell woven into the end. She'd seen the likes of this last before. It was a spirit braid, the sort that was hung up outside of superstitious houses to keep malevolent spirits at bay. It was the sort of protection one would need if one was going to live out in the bones. Only Konrad scorned such things. Konrad. His words echoed in her mind. Take some care. When he had asked her to help him, she didn't think he had meant that she should track down the man to his own house. Perhaps she should take Konrad along for safety. But that would mean exposing her secrets to him, and he had not offered so much to her. If he did not trust her, she would not trust him either. She stood in the street for a moment and closed her eyes, summoning her memories of her earlier visions. She waited, hardly breathing, as they replayed themselves in her mind's eye. Eyes still closed, she began to turn on the spot until her inner sense told her she faced true. This way. She opened her eyes only a little, enough to see the street with both her physical and her spiritual vision. Houses and carriages and people passed by in a blur, unnoticed. She saw only the street in front of her feet and the destination. Out through the city gate she walked, slow and sure, with the patter of Weverot's small feet as accompaniment to her own soft tread. No lights shone in the bone forest, save an occasional will-o'-the-wisp bobbing in the distance, but she knew better than to follow those. A pale moon shone fitfully overhead, brightening and fading again as clouds streamed across the skies. She had to slow her steps further in order to make her way safely through the forest's irregular pathways. If she expanded her other senses, she could be forewarned about the deep, ice-shrouded puddles that loomed out of the darkness, and about the pits and gullies and layers of tangling branches that blocked her way. But her physical sight only confused her, burdening her mind with too many impressions. So she closed her eyes and viewed the nighttime forest in her mind's eye alone. A landscape in ghost white, shimmering in the moonlight, the water gleaming indigo and the earth as black as the grave. She knew she passed the site of Lady Rostikova's death. The traces of it hovered still in the air, threads of black sickness marking the ether. She gave this a wide berth. It was not very far beyond this place when she came at last to her destination. Her spirit vision saw dwellings crouching, crabbed and dark among the white trees, sensed people moving within them. Rumor had spoken before of a community of spirit witches hidden out in the forests, but she had never yet seen it for herself. To the physical eye, these houses would be virtually indiscernible, so cleverly were they built. They blended into the crook of branch and trunk, into the soft rise and fall of the ground, perfectly camouflaged out here in the reaches of the bones where few people came. Irenanda paused for a moment to admire. For a brief second she wished that she had not forsaken her mother's people and moved into the city. This life, wreathed in the natural forces of the bone forest, might have been hers. But she shook the thought away. This was no perfect world, no ideal society, not even for people like her. Somewhere in this settlement lived the man who had killed Nabnina and left her body to rot in filth and uncleanliness, alone in the midst of the forest. The same man now plotted someone else's death. Even those who revered and promoted the natural balances of life and death were capable of these offenses against the Malik's order. The house she wanted would be on the edges of this little village. She sensed that instinctively. Her mind's image showed her a poorly tended, ramshackle version of the neatly assembled property she saw around her now. This man, she realized, felt very differently from her about life out here. He resented the meanness of the dwellings, the relentless chill and damp of the marsh, the perpetual half-light under the endless, dripping fog. He saw none of the beauties, felt nothing for the elevation of spirit. He saw only privations, discomfort, and obligations. He let his house fall to ruin, and he consciously broke the principles of her mother's people. He would want the life that Lady Rostikova had so recently enjoyed, she felt sure. But then why kill the very people whose lives he coveted and admired? Perhaps she could find this out. She drifted soundlessly around the edges of the witch village, growing nearer to the poison man's home with every step. And then it was before her, the same narrow, crabbed, shabby house she'd seen in her mind's eye. With a swift pang of regret, she let the spirit vision slip away from her and opened her own eyes fully. It was difficult to discern the contours of the house in this barely moonlit darkness, even though she knew it was there. And the fog muffled all sound, the drip-drop of the rain and condensation, all that she could hear clearly. Was the poison man within? Turning, she looked for Weveroth. She had forgotten him for a time, all her thoughts and senses occupied with the task of finding her way. But he had followed. He crouched behind her, fluffing out his drenched fur. "Is it safe?" she asked him. He hopped forward, nose questing, and disappeared inside the house. She waited, but he did not come out. That was clear enough. In she went, following the route that Weveroth had taken to find the door. The house consisted of a single room, not spacious, its narrow confines cluttered with furniture and objects. Spirit braids hung inside the doorway, like the ones she had seen in her visions. She ducked under them, taking care to avoid clattering the bells that hung from the ends and announcing her presence to the community. A bed was tucked into one corner, cupboards lined the walls, and a table stood near the door. All were made simply from wood and braided withies. The covers on the bed were sewn from rough cloth and hides, warm and comfortable, but simple indeed. The house contained everything a person might need for reasonable comfort, but it absolutely lacked in luxuries or even beauty, except for one thing. A willow-woven box rested on a shelf, placed in pride of position as if it contained something special. Opening the lid, she found a collection of 3 rings and a bracelet. All were finely worked out of precious metals and stones, gold and silver, ruby, and even one small diamond. They were as out of place here as she herself would be in the grand houses of Achamet. That they did not belong to the owner of this dwelling was obvious enough. Had the poison man indeed killed Navdina? Had he taken these from her body? But that didn't make sense. The newspapers had said that Lady Rostikova had not been robbed by her killer. She had little time to consider the questions further, for a squeak from Weveroth warned her of danger. Closing the box's lid, she cast about for somewhere to hide. It was hopeless, of course. The room was far too cramped to afford any hiding place, and she herself was too big to fit into any of the tiny cupboards or underneath the low bed. Could she reach the door without being discovered? She whirled, but too late. A tall man stood in the doorway, staring at her. It was the poison man. She recognized him immediately, not only by his height and his features and the colors of his skin and hair and eyes, but also by the impression he left on her spiritual senses. His imprint on the ether was befouled, corrupted, and shrouded with the sickness of his own soul and the filth he had inflicted upon the spirit world by his crimes.
"I know you,"
he said in a low voice.
"The apothecary."
He entered the house, letting the bells on the spirit braids ring as he brushed past them.
"I could see you were one of us," he continued, "even though you've forsaken your village and your people and you live in the foreign city. I thought they could trust you not to betray me, not to betray us. But you followed me here. Why?"
She grinned at him. "You've betrayed your own village, and far worse. You've no right to speak of betrayal. Besides, you are quick to jump to conclusions. Perhaps I simply wish to hire you." He folded his arms, staring her down.
"Hire me? For what?"
"Twice now you've come to my shop, seeking lethal poisons. From that I conclude that you're open to certain assignments that many would balk at. If I wanted to have someone removed, would I be correct in speaking to you?"
His eyes narrowed suspiciously. "I might have traded those poisons."
"Maybe," she shrugged. "But I doubt it. Traders are only concerned with which poisons are rarest and most valuable. You were looking specifically for the most virulent poisons, the ones that are always fatal to the imbiber. That tells me a great deal."
"How do you know I used them myself?"
"I don't. But that's a fine collection of jewelry you have there, and I doubt you were given it for any innocent reason." His eyes flicked to the box on the shelf, then back to her face.
"You've been snooping."
"Yep," she grinned again. It wasn't the reaction he expected from her. No one ever did. It made blunt honesty combined with levity a useful tool for throwing people off balance. It worked again. He looked uncertain, then confused.
"What exactly are you looking for?"
"So you are available for hire. That tells me a lot, too."
"Such as?"
He folded his arms and glared at her. In that posture and with his coloring and height, he reminded her a little of Konrad.
"It tells me you're an outcast here, or if not that, then barely tolerated. And that's why you had to ask me for information. You're banned from the old knowledge, aren't you? Some of it you take anyway. But poisoncraft isn't one of those things. There are no books out here, and nobody would teach you."
She stared at him hard, all traces of levity or even friendliness gone from her manner.
"And that's because you're tainted, corrupted probably beyond recall. You've already transgressed too greatly to redeem yourself. So you felt, why try? You became an assassin, one of the worst kind. When somebody came to you asking for a slow, painful, hideous death to be inflicted on Lady Rostikova, you were quite willing to oblige, as long as they paid well. And they did, didn't they?"
She glanced again at the box as she spoke. Its contents were extremely valuable. He'd been well paid for his newest, worst transgressions against the order of the worlds.
"You're not here to hire me,"
he said flatly, his manner turning menacing. But she was unmoved.
"The Malykant hunts you,"
she said softly.
"Do you know that?"
He froze at her words, turning pale. His hands shook, and he swallowed hard. It took him some moments to get himself under control.
"You know this is fact?"
She shrugged.
"The newspaper said Rostikova was opened up and missing a rib. You know what that means. Didn't you read the reports?"
His lips twisted into a smirk.
"No books out here, as you said. No papers either."
"You should have known you'd be hunted," she said coldly. "Deaths like hers, they stain the ether permanently, and the only thing that will ever clean away that taint is your death."
He was shaking again, his eyes wild.
"No, that's not true. It's never happened before."
"You've killed others, is that what you're saying? I'm not surprised, but I think you've been lucky, or circumspect. The patterns of your crimes were thinner, flimsier, and they faded into the ether so that barely a hint of your wrongdoing was left. Not this time. The Malykant will find you."
"With your help?"
His voice had gone deathly quiet, and the way he was staring at her began to seem frightening. Summoning her courage, she stared him down.
"Maybe," she said in a similar tone. "But with or without my help, he'll find you. You'd better tell me everything now, and maybe he'll have mercy on your miserable spirit."
"Everything? Such as what?"
Such as the name of your new target, the person the Eiger root was intended for, or the name of the person who hired you. It's somebody rich, from the look of the reward. Somebody from the city. Give me a name."
His lips twisted in contempt as he looked at her.
"If you believe me to be so easily cowed, you are not so sensitive a reader as I thought. No, you're good, I'll admit. You read me back in the shop, didn't you? That's how you found me. I should have taken more care. I know you for what you are, even though you're a foreigner."
Foreigner. Nanda had heard that word many times before. Her pale coloring was close enough to that of the majority of Echemet's residents, but her pale white blonde hair and sky-blue eyes marked her out as other. Her parents had been born far away, far to the north, and though she herself had been born in Echemet, she was not really one of them. It had been difficult, forging her place among them. It was one of the things that drew her to Konrad. With his dark coloring, he too stood out in Echemet, but he too had found a way to work himself into their society. "I am a reader," she said, lifting her chin proudly, "and a witch, though my roots are, as you say, far from here. It doesn't matter. The spirit world is the same, and the natural order is the same, and both reject you utterly."
"I can't let you leave, of course,"
was all he said in reply.
"Now that you found me so easily, you'll find me again no matter where I go."
The light in his eyes pierced her courage, and she began to tremble. She got carried away in her indignation at his arrogance, the insolent way he bore himself, and his filth staining the ether further with every step that he took. She shouldn't have confronted him. But it was too late to think of that now.
"Kill me, and you'll only increase your debt to the Overlord," she said quickly. "There'll be no mercy for you."
"You may be right," he agreed. "But there are other ways to dispose of you."
He advanced on her, and she backed away. There was nowhere to go, of course. She soon found herself pressed against the back wall of the house, with the poison man's large frame between her and the door. He began to whisper under his breath, invoking spirits to come to his aid. It was the corrupted spirits he called upon, of course, those whose inner lights had been darkened long ago by their actions in aiding others like him. They, too, were outcasts, shunned by the Malykant and all those who followed him, and they flocked to this man's call. He grinned nastily as wisps streamed out of the mist, twisted goblin shapes that clutched at her hair and her clothes and pinched her skin. 100 tiny hands grasped her, digging their tiny claws into her soul and tugging hard. She fought, trying desperately to call her own spirit guides to her aid. But the poison man laughed and blew powder into her face, and her wits scattered like seeds on the wind.
"Enjoy your precious spirit lens,"
she heard him say, and then he and his shabby house faded. The white spirit world she'd seen in her mind's eye became real as she was pulled bodily through. The landscape glowed brightly enough to half-blind her mortal eyes, all fierce lightning etched on deep shadow. Shapes formed and faded around her as the wisps whirled and shrieked and drove her mad with their clutching and pulling and their insidious whispers inside her head. Her mind had dissolved into a mess of fear, and though she grasped at conscious thought, it eluded her. Her thoughts spun and her body whirled in confusion, seeking nothing but escape from the vicious presences that sought to ensnare her soul. Screaming her fear and despair, she ran. In the space she'd left behind, the poison man stood, holding his breath as he dusted the powder from his hands. He didn't notice the tiny gold-furred monkey that ducked out of the house and sped away into the night. Chapter 8. Konrad left his house in the early hours of the morning, when the moon was high and the sky only partially covered with cloud. The glow it emitted was feeble, but it served to illuminate the streets somewhat. All the better. That would make it harder for his assailant to hide from him. Itapi and Utapi were alert for danger, one sailing the winds a few feet in front of him and the other some way behind. They had camouflaged themselves to the utmost, so much so that he couldn't even see them with his mortal eyes. He made no particular attempt to hide. He had grown tired of the nameless, shapeless threat hanging over him since his visit to his master's temple a day or two ago. If his pursuer intended harm, he would prefer to resolve the matter now. In the end, though, his precautions availed him little. Utapi's voice had barely begun to whisper a warning in his mind when a dark shape leaped out of the shadows before him. In moments he was down. A dark-clad figure loomed over him, a knife glinting in one hand. His other hand was fastened around Konrad's throat, squeezing hard. So it was to be murder, then. Very well. Konrad was by no means defenseless. His profession was a dangerous one, and he knew how to fight. He did so now, avoiding the downward stroke of the knife and throwing the assassin off him. He made it onto his feet, and for a few moments he held his own, strike for strike, against his assailant. But this was no ordinary threat. The man was a professional and horribly strong. Konrad knew he was in trouble. The knife blade flashed again, too close, and a line of pain raced across his torso. The next one would probably kill him. Sensing his danger, Itapi and Utapi rose to his assistance. He felt the flicker of hope. Another instant, and they would have the assassin's soul bound, and the onslaught would stop. Maybe he would avoid impalement after all. The assassin was faster even than he'd feared. Perhaps sensing the new threat, the man redoubled his efforts, moving so fast Konrad couldn't even follow his movements. Konrad had only a moment to wonder where in the world his enemy had found this man, before the knife blade found its mark. He fell once more, stabbed to the heart, pain crushing his chest. He lay for an instant, panting with shock and agony, trying not to look at the hilt protruding from his chest. He watched with distant interest as the assassin's body stiffened and backed away. The serpents had him then, but too late. Gripping the knife's handle and gritting his teeth, Konrad pulled out the blade. He tried to do it fast, but it took an inordinately long time for the length of sharp metal to slide out of the ruins of his muscles, his skin, his heart. He kept his eyes fixed on his would-be killer as he did so, knowing the man would not expect this. He waited, tense, for the renewed pain of enforced healing. He was not permitted to die, not as long as he served the Malykant. The wound would force itself closed, his flesh would knit together once more, and he would be whole. It would hurt, badly, but he would survive. Nothing happened. He felt a flicker of panic. The Malykant's favor would last only as long as Konrad pleased him. Was he pleased now? Had his primary servant performed as expected these past few years? Konrad knew that if his master's favor had been withdrawn, he may not know about it at first, not until a stray knife blade stabbed him through, and this time he did not heal, and Konrad's life would be over, and a new Malykant would be chosen. Was that happening now? He tried to suppress his growing panic, refusing to let it show in his face. The assassin, still held in the grip of his serpent shades, would see nothing of his doubt. A new thought occurred to him in the midst of his confusion. Were he to die, would it be such a bad thing? His life had its advantages, but no part of it was his own. His tasks were brutal and unpleasant, his master relentless. He was isolated, and he admitted it. Lonely. Perhaps it was time to rest. But then came the pain, waves of it gripping him tight as his tortured flesh mended itself. He lay shaking as the wound closed, and his body restored itself to full health. A cold voice pierced his dazed thoughts.
You have not earned a rest yet, my Malykant. Get on with it.
Yes, master.
he thought weakly in reply. He got to his feet, his attention once more on the dark figure who had sought to take his life. He enjoyed the expression of complete horror on the man's face as his injured-to-the-death victim stood up and advanced on him. "Good effort," Konrad said to him. He had, after all, done a good job. It wasn't his fault that the Malekt hated training new servants. The assassin's own knife was in Konrad's hand. He didn't waste any time. One quick movement drew the blade across the killer's throat, and he dropped, eyes wide in shock. The serpents vacated his dying body in 2 puffs of cold wind, and the 3 of them watched dispassionately as the killer died. Konrad stood a moment longer, flexing his arms and torso and neck. He was a little stiff, but otherwise in great health. His clothes were ruined, of course, slashed through and soaked in blood, but he didn't need to be well dressed for his next task. "Well, onward," he said silently to his serpents. He walked on, leaving the body lying in the street. Konrad's next nighttime visit to the Rostikov house was easier, as he was familiar with the plan of the building and the habits of the servants. But it was also harder, for the inhabitants were alert to the possibility of intruders. He was forced to wait until the moon was hidden behind a significant bank of cloud, and then to take a less direct route into the house. The rear wall was composed of large blocks of old stone. He climbed it with ease, aiming for the servants' garret at the top. He could feel the sickness that loomed in the room above him. Its scent wove through the ether, acrid and sharp, but not, to his relief, redolent of death. Etreya was very ill, but she would not die. Not yet, at least. Reaching her window, he paused to survey the room. As he had both feared and hoped, no attendant waited upon her. Either by order of their mistress or through fear of infection, the inhabitants of this house had left the nurse to suffer alone. He eased open the window and slid inside, closing it behind him, for her room was without a fire, and already cold without the winter winds whirling through the casement. Itapi and Utapi were with him, wrapped around his arms like bracelets. They separated themselves from him and streamed over to the bed where Etreya lay. She was far gone in sickness, that was clear. Her skin was wet with sweat, and her breath came in shallow, feverish gasps. A livid red rash covered her face and neck and disappeared inside her nightclothes. Poor woman. "Itapi, Utapi, bind her." Though she was living, the serpents could still merge themselves with her soul and help her to animate her own body. He had attempted this once before on another witness whose consciousness was largely gone in illness. It was cumbersome, but it worked. Judging by the way Etreya twisted in her bed and moved her lips in ceaseless, soundless talk, she was delirious and beyond her own control. She would need the help. He waited as the serpent spirit's wavering forms vanished inside Etreya's tortured body. After a moment, her restless movements ceased and her lips closed. The serpents had control of her. He sat down in the chair next to the bedside. "Miss Morodova," he said, speaking softly. "Etreya, do you hear me?" Her eyes opened and her head turned towards him, though she didn't seem to be seeing anything. "Yes," she croaked, her throat sore from gasping in her fever. "I need you to tell me what's going on in this house. The Rostikovs, you know them better than anybody." Etreya coughed, a harsh, rasping sound that chilled him. He hadn't sensed her death approaching, but could he be mistaken? "Calm yourself," he murmured as she coughed harder. Not only was this bad for her already tortured throat and lungs, but soon she would wake the house. To his relief, her coughing subsided, and she sank back into her pillows. "The Rostikovs," she said painfully. "I mustn't speak of them." "You must," he insisted. "I must know. For Navnina." "Navi," she repeated, and her face softened.
Such a pretty child. Prettier than her mother. Lena hated her, but she didn't deserve it.
Konrad frowned. Lena? He gripped her hand and leaned forward, trying to keep her attention. Etreya, who is Lena?
Lena was so jealous. So much anger in her. It was as if she knew. But she couldn't know. She didn't know.
This, of course, was the flaw in his plan. The serpents could stabilize her, allowing her to talk, but they couldn't influence the flow of ideas in her fevered brain. She was rambling, and he couldn't tell if any of it was useful. But at least it was something. Tell me more about Lena, he said. Lena and Navi.
Navi was good to her, but Lena wouldn't have it. She was cruel, so heartless. When the lady sent her away, she said it was for her own good. And it was a good school, but Lena knew. We all knew. She sent her away from Navi.
The lady in question was probably Navdina's mother, Konrad guessed. But who was Lena, and why would the Rostikovs take a direct interest in her fate? Lena. A thought flashed into his mind, a dark thought. Do you mean Annalena?
Her father called her Anna, but to all others she was Lena.
Annalena. The current Lady Rostikova, wife of the murdered Amrav, was named Annalena. That couldn't be a coincidence.
Where did Lena go?
She didn't like the school. She didn't like anything. She never understood why Navi had a nurse and was taught at home, but she had to go away and be taught with 100 other girls. Poor girl, but what could I do? I had no money to give her.
Why should you have given her money?
Because she was my child. Her own mother's life was given over to another's growth and education, and she hated me for it. I loved Navi more, she said, and it was true. Spirits help me. I did love her more.
Etreya was growing agitated, but Konrad couldn't stop her, not yet. He was learning a great deal despite the random nature of her reflections. He had to be sure he was drawing the right conclusions. Are you saying that Annalena Rostikova was once Annalena Morodova?
That was her name,
she muttered.
Hated name. Not her name at all. Spirits, forgive me.
Tears wet Etreya's face, and she began to struggle against the binding of the serpents, her fists clenched. Calm yourself, he said again, trying to soothe her, but she was unreachable.
I should never have done it,
she wailed.
I tried to undo it, but it was too late. And how could she know? I told her at last, and she was not surprised. But she was a baby at the time.
Konrad began to get a cold feeling in the pit of his stomach. You did something, he prompted, when Lena was a baby.
They were born the same week, the very same week, and they were so alike. It seemed like fate. I knew that the Rostikov child would have everything, and my poor child would have nothing. It was mere impulse. I should have resisted, but then it was done.
You swapped them. He saw it all in an instant, and his body sickened at the knowledge that a single, weak action by one woman 25 years ago had transformed the fate of 2 girls forever, and destroyed them both.
I did,
Etreya wept.
I had the care of them both on some days. One day I changed their clothes and swapped their cradles. When the Lord and Lady returned, I gave my Lena into her ladyship's arms, and just like that, she became Navdina, and Navi that was, poor child, she became Annalena Morodova. I thought only of my poor girl's fate. Not once did I think about the Rostikov girl, not until later. But I couldn't undo it then.
No, such a ruse would only work in the first blush of life, if the child had uninvolved, aristocratic parents who could afford to pay a nurse to do most of the child-rearing. Once they had grown enough to develop distinctive individual features, exchanging the infants would no longer be an option. Atreya would have had to simply live with her sin. He knew enough of her character to guess that it would have plagued her sorely ever since then. "Atreya," he said firmly, "did you tell them what you had done?"
"I told Lena,"
she said, and repeated the words twice more, her voice shaking. "Not Navi?"
"No, I couldn't face it."
"When did you tell Lena?"
"A year ago. I couldn't keep it from her. She was so angry. I thought she had to know. I thought if I confessed, I might be forgiven. Be at ease."
It hadn't worked out that way, he guessed. Annalena, already angry at the injustices she saw in society, had become angrier still. And what then? Amrav Rostikov had been married only 6 months ago. Had she created this plan, hard on her false mother's revelations? She had pursued Amrav, married him, and killed her rival, or had her killed. It was yet unclear whose hand had actually taken Navdina's life. But why then kill Amrav? If she wished to rid herself of him in time, it was unwise in the extreme to do so immediately after the death of her cousin by marriage. Some pieces of the puzzle yet remained unsolved.
"It's my fault,"
whispered Atreya.
"My fault. Poor Navi. Poor Lena."
Poor Atreya, he silently added. She had committed a grave crime, but an impulsive one, and she'd paid for it with lifelong regrets and guilt. And at last she had had to watch her daughter, her real daughter, die for her mistake. Such a high price on human weakness. A high, chittering noise interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see a small, dark shape hurl itself against the glass of the window he had closed behind himself. It threw itself at the glass again, and a dull thumping noise echoed around the room. A monkey, and that was a flicker of gold fur illuminated by the low moonlight. He crossed the room in 2 quick strides and flung the window open. Weveroth tumbled into the room, still chattering. "Hush, hush," he murmured, cradling the panicked creature. "Don't wake the house." It subsided and stared up at him in silence, its black eyes huge in the darkness. "Where is Nanda?" he murmured. He saw no sign of any message from Nanda secreted about the monkey's small body, and the creature's obvious alarm worried him. Something had gone wrong, and it was he who had sent her after the poison man. "Calm yourself, Weveroth," he murmured, thankful that Atreya was too lost in the darkness of her own dreams to attend to him. "Itapi. Utapi." The serpents released Atreya and came to him, awaiting command. "Does anyone guard the door?" They were gone, and back in moments.
"No, Malykant."
Konrad shook his head, disappointed. Had Nuratov failed to receive his note, or had he been unable or unwilling to act upon it? He gave brief thought to leaving Itapi in attendance on Atreya, but dismissed the idea. He might need both his serpents before the night was over. He would find Irananda, and then return for the nurse. And Annalena Rostikova. "Is the lady of the house within?" The serpent's answer came instantly.
"No, Malykant."
That made him pause. No? He had not really expected a negative. Where was Lena at this hour of the night? What mischief was she working somewhere out in the city, or beyond? He suffered a moment's frustration at the thought. He would have liked to take up the chase immediately, find her wherever she was hiding, and complete his obligation to the Malikt. But no, not yet. First he must find Nanda. Out of the window again he went, and down the side of the building. Weveroth scampered ahead of him and waited at the bottom. "Weveroth," he whispered to the monkey when he had regained his feet, "take me to your mistress." The monkey turned and ran, and Konrad and the serpents followed. If Konrad had had time to think clearly about the matter, he might have expected to be taken to Irenanda's shop, or her house, or possibly to the poison man. He did not expect to see the world dissolve around him before he had gone more than 3 steps, or to experience the stark contrasts of the spirit world searing his eyes and paralyzing his brain with light and shadow and fear. Dread seized him, and for a moment his breath stopped. How had Nanda come to be here? And what would be left of her when he found her? This last question was soon answered, for faithful Weveroth located his mistress with unerring accuracy. A dark figure rushed at him, dark yet lit with living, vivid color that was anathema to the spirit plane. A mortal, her bright, pale hair loose and streaming in the spirit winds, her body in a frenzy of motion. She rushed past him, eyes wide and staring, but not recognizing him. He turned and caught her. He needed all of his strength to hold her in her wild panic. Nanda. He repeated her name a few times, speaking close to her ear, but she did not quiet. Her mind was far gone in fear, and perhaps more than that. Spirit wisps dived and danced around her shivering form, pinching her, raking their claws through her soul, and as each howling sprite launched itself at her, she trembled anew. The serpents needed no orders from him. They flew at the spirit wisps, and Konrad felt their inaudible snarls as faint shivers in his bones. Itapi opened her mouth wide, too wide, and snapped her incorporeal jaws shut around the wriggling form of a wisp. She swallowed, and down it went. Utapi followed her lead. One by one the vicious spirits were consumed and dissolved by the Malik's servants. Irenanda stood, alone except for the 2 snake spirits that hovered near her face. She swayed. "Bind her," he said to the serpents then, and they obeyed. Nanda's body stiffened as they took control of her bones and muscles and skin, and she stood rigid in his arms. Her eyes, though, they jerked still, this way and that, still seeking escape. Her mind was unaware that help had come, that rescue was at hand. His heart twisted in his chest, and for the first time in so long he was truly grateful for the harsh blessing that had dampened the strength of his emotions. He could steady her, aware of his dismay and his guilt and his fear for her, but not touched by it. He gripped her hand with calm strength, turned and began walking back the way they had come. Nanda walked stiffly beside him. It was not to his city house that he took her, or even to her own home. He stepped out of the spirit lands and into the bone forest south of Ekamet. His own house rose out of the mist, only a few steps ahead, strong winds setting it swaying on its long legs. He watched as the serpents made Irenanda climb the rope ladder, wondering if the rigidity in her limbs would allow her to navigate the ladder successfully. Her ascent was not graceful, but she disappeared safely through the trap-door, and he hastened after her. "Lie her down," he instructed, and the serpents carried their prisoner to the bed and caused her to lay herself out upon it. Even recumbent, there was no hint of relaxation in her poor, frightened body, and her eyes continued to jerk and shiver in her head. "Weveroth," he said, "I need you to help me." He was unsure how much Nanda's pet understood, more than it ought to, certainly, and he judged it best to speak freely to it. Weveroth stopped at his feet and sat back on his haunches, waiting. "What happened to her?" The monkey lifted one paw, drew it back, and then forward, opening his fingers as if releasing something. It waited expectantly for a moment, then repeated the motion. "Something was thrown at her," Konrad interpreted. "Powder. I can think of 3 things that it might have been." He went to his shelves and collected 3 jars. These he placed before Weveroth, removing the lid on each. The monkey stuffed its nose into each jar in turn, and sat back again. It made no sign of recognition towards any of the 3. "None of those?" Konrad frowned, puzzled. Obviously, whatever she'd inhaled had given her hallucinations, uncontrollable fear, paranoia, and anxiety. It had also restricted her breathing. Each breath came hard and short, though her chest heaved. He would have thought it would be one of these. But there was another possibility, a forbidden one. Why had Nanda been so hounded by the cruelest shades of the spirit lands? They did not usually attach themselves idly, and never in such great numbers. Someone, presumably the poison man, had set them on her, and if he was willing to bargain with such creatures, nothing would prevent him from further such bargains, the sort for which a mortal must trade pieces of their living soul. What had the poison man gained in return? Spirit dust, a concoction of mist and earth and shreds of lost ether from the Deathlands. The forsaken goblins and corrupted sprites of that dark spirit land took it and warped it, mixed it with their sweat and their spit, and ground it to powder. Its possession and use was banned across all mortal lands, that he knew. And why? Because its effects were permanent.
Hirananda had taken this filth into herself, and it had made itself part of her, corrupting her body and infecting her mind. No known way existed to reverse its effects. He stared at Nanda, her thin body shivering still as she lay on his bed, held there only by the invasive influence of his serpents. Her mind was already gone, probably, and her body would soon follow, melting away into the mists of the Deathlands. His fault.
There was one thing only that he could try. The mere thought sent fear whispering through his thoughts, seeking to make a coward of him. He gathered his master's coldness about himself, watching as his breath began to steam in the air. He closed his eyes and prayed. The cold deepened around him until he, too, began to shiver, clad though he was in his thickest clothes. Ice blossomed across the floor, creeping into the corners of his forest house, spreading over the furniture and reaching long-fingered hands up the walls to the ceiling.
"The Malikt, the Overlord comes,"
whispered the serpents, and Conrad's heart began to pound hard in his chest.
"My servant calls, but he has no vengeance to offer me."
The voice was deep and dark and full of thunder. It ripped through Conrad's mind, threatening to split him in two. He gritted his teeth and stood his ground, his chin raised high. It did not do to cower before the Malikt. "My lord," he managed to say, "I have not yet completed the task you recently set for me, but with the help of this woman I am close." He felt the Spirit Lord's chilling disapproval at his words.
"It is not permitted to you to seek help. No other may interfere in my doings."
"Yes, Lord," Conrad panted. "I have erred, but the punishment for that must rest with me. I beg you to lift this affliction this woman has incurred on my behalf. It is not deserved. She sought only to serve you. Nothing happened." The silence stretched out so long that Conrad's hopes fled into the cold, and he merely stood, empty of the depth of guilt and sadness that should have been his to suffer.
"I do so,"
came the terrible voice again at last.
"but not on your account, Malykant."
Then on whose, Conrad wondered, but he did not dare to ask. He was only grateful. He bowed his head in relief. "My gratitude is beyond expression, Lord Malikt."
"I know."
Then the cold was gone. The ice melted all at once into frigid water and trickled away through the floor. The Malikt was gone.
"Konrad?"
Hirananda's voice sounding small and lost even in this humble space. "I'm here." He went to her, looking her over. Her shaking had stopped, and to his immense relief her eyes were her own again. She looked on him with confusion, but also with recognition. He knelt by the bed and smoothed back the pale, sweat-dampened hair that lay in tangles around her face. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should never have asked it of you." She just shook her head, and he guessed she was too tired to speak. "But you must speak," he said out loud. "I need to hear what you've seen." So she told him in short sentences forced from her exhausted body. It was enough. "Thank you," he said when she had finished. He layered blankets over her, tucked them in around her bone-white face, and gave Weveros to her. "You'll be safe here," he said. "Rest." She didn't answer. She was already asleep. Moving with quiet care, Konrad equipped himself for his next task. He collected a packet of powder from a locked chest and tucked it into his coat. He checked that the rib bones were in their accustomed place in his top inside pocket. He took up his hat and the scarf that kept the winter chills off his neck. Then, with a final glance at Irananda sleeping peacefully in his bed, he slipped down the rope ladder
and out into the bones.
Chapter 9.
There was a deathly stillness out in the forest, that air of expectancy that seems to wait breathless for some event to occur, or some danger to pass before customary activity may be resumed. It was the dead of night, but even at this hour there should have been more life. As Konrad passed through the half-frozen, mist-drenched trees, animals hid in their burrows, and birds cowered in the dormant winter branches. Even the moon refused to shine, hiding itself behind a cloak of heavy cloud. Konrad ignored it all. He had his purpose now, and this was the part that he both anticipated and dreaded: the hunt, and at the end of it, the kill. He strode on, relentless, following Irananda's directions in his mind as he made for the house where the treacherous poison man resided. He found the house, though not without difficulty. Nanda had told him to use his spirit eyes, and so he did. He had not yet asked her how she had come to take this approach, nor how she was able to as a mere apothecary. That conversation could wait. But that Irananda had secrets of her own was becoming quite clear to him. He let the deep shadows of the real world fade as his physical vision gave way to his spirit sight, and the forest turned pale and gauzy. In this state, walking halfway between the plains, he could just about bear the extreme brights and darks of the spirit lands. The contrast served him well now. The trees and earth faded to white, while figures and structures stained themselves darkest black. The house revealed itself to him, tucked into the embrace of a hoary old tree. A slight sound reached his ears coming from within. Someone, then, was at home. Konrad stopped, letting the spirit vision fade. He could see it now that he knew where it was. The doorway was nothing but a slit in the woodwork, just wide enough for a grown man's shoulders to fit through. He took a moment to extract the powder packet from his pocket. With his other hand he drew a long, obsidian-bladed knife from the sheath on his boot. Thus equipped, he went inside. A man stood facing the far wall, his back to the door. This man was tall, with skin and hair of similar shades to Konrad's own. Konrad watched him for a moment in silence, blocking the doorway with his own tall frame. The man was pulling things out of a rough cabinet, rummaging in drawers and packing things into a bundle that lay beside him. He worked fast, knocking things over in his haste. He hadn't heard Konrad's arrival. "Are we going somewhere?" Konrad asked in a low voice. The man spun around, eyes wide. He didn't ask who Konrad was. He didn't need to. Konrad had thrown off the camouflage that protected his identity during his daily life. Everything that he was shone in his face, in the aura of menace and power that hung heavy in the air around him. The man's lips moved soundlessly,
his chest heaving with the effort of drawing in breath under the sudden, paralyzing fear that seized him. Konrad watched him in silence.
She spoke the truth.
The words emerged shakily, and sweat shone on the poison man's forehead. Konrad lifted a brow.
She.
That she whose sanity you condemned in order to save your own worthless skin?
Another offense for which you must also pay.
Malykant, gasped the poison man, and Konrad smiled and waited. The rush of fear began to abate a little, and cunning reasserted itself in the eyes of the man who had destroyed Navdina Rostikova. Good. This one would fight for his life. He would run. And perhaps he would run to the one person he imagined could protect him. "Shall we get on with it?" Konrad said mildly. He stood aside, leaving the door free. "You have one chance." As he spoke, he summoned the serpents from their place deep in his heart, and they streamed free, coalescing into sudden brightness. "Better hurry," said Konrad, and the poison man ran. Konrad followed. He didn't bother to run. His stride lengthened and ate up the ground, carrying through the pitch-dark forest at inhuman speed. Ahead of him the poison man stumbled and fell, picked himself up and ran on, then fell again. Each time he tumbled to the ground, Konrad slowed his pace, allowing his quarry to maintain his apparent lead. But he never let himself fall far back enough to lose sight of his prey. He knew that every time the poison man glanced back, he would see the dark shape that was Konrad, still in silent, relentless pursuit, with the shivery, gleaming shapes of Itapi and Utapi riding the winds beside him. The only question that remained in Konrad's mind was the poison man's probable destination. Where was he running to in this last despairing flight? That he was going to Annalena was likely, but she was not at home, and Konrad guessed that the man knew that. It would be some secret meeting spot that he was aiming for. A rational man might think better of leading the Malykant to his co-conspirator, but Konrad had deliberately frightened this one. Frenzied with fear, still imagining desperately that he could escape, the poison man did exactly as Konrad would expect of a coward. Back into the city they went, in this mockery of a chase. The quarry charged down the silent streets, gasping for breath through lungs burning with exertion, wandering frequently off course as he checked repeatedly over his shoulder. Konrad was still there, unshakable, untiring, relentless. But when he sensed that his quarry was nearing the end of his flight, it became time to drop back, conceal himself in the shadows, and allow the poison man to think he had shaken his pursuer. He sent the serpents after him instead, and they sailed away, dampening their spectre glow to a mere flicker. It was to a small, innocuous-looking terraced house that the hunted man went, a narrow building with empty windows, decaying shutters, and an overgrown garden. Konrad watched as the poison man went inside, and the serpents, virtually indiscernible, ghosted in after him. A moment passed, and then a light went on upstairs. A figure moved past the window, and a second followed, a feminine shape. It was time, then. He stepped slowly up to the house. The man had had the presence of mind to lock the door behind himself. Laudable instincts at a time of crisis, but little impediment to Konrad. He touched his cold fingers to the lock. The mechanisms sprang open under his icy touch, and the door creaked ajar. The house was too small to possess even an entrance hall. He walked straight into a small sitting room, devoid of furniture and very poorly kept. Paper hung off the walls in peeling strips. The carpet was rotting away, and everywhere he looked he saw chipped paint. The rest of the house was no better. As he climbed the stairs, he worried that the faltering woodwork would fail to hold his weight. The steps shook as he climbed, but they held. The sound of raised voices reached his ears as he paused, registering the source. At the end of a short, dim corridor, a door stood closed, a slim bar of light shining at its base. There were his killers, neatly boxed and ready for him. He approached on silent feet, listening.
Don't truly believe he was the servant of the Malykant?
It was the female voice who spoke, and her tone dripped with scorn.
He's a fairy story to frighten children, nothing more.
Fool, replied the poison man. What of Navdina's missing ribs? What of your husband's?
The police do that themselves to generate fear in the perpetrators. Makes us easier to catch, so they believe. Looking at you, it might well work. Lance, pull yourself together.
There was a silence for a few long seconds. And the man I just met, what was he, an actor hired by the police? Your complacency will kill us both. Lance, as it appeared he was called, could not hide the tremor in his words.
You may depart as you choose,
Lena replied with cool indifference.
What?
Lance gasped. You dismiss me? And so easily?
What of your promises? Which were they?
You spoke of marriage.
And you believed me. That is the precious part. What will you do, Lance? Kill me as well? You'll certainly get nothing more that way. Leave quietly, and I'll see that you are rewarded.
Konrad heard the distinct sound of a man spitting. He could imagine the refined Lena's revulsion.
I will leave,
Lance snarled.
I don't know how he found me before. He could find me again. You'd be wise to leave, too. But if you don't, if you are too convinced of your power, I, for one, will not mourn your death.
Lena laughed, the way a woman might laugh at a party when in company with a handsome gentleman.
Charming boy. Go, then. I'm tired of you.
But when Lance turned to leave, he found Konrad blocking the door. The Malykant watched as the horror dawned anew in his eyes and his breath stopped in his chest. Then, to Konrad's surprise, his eyes filled with weird glee, and he laughed.
Well,
he chuckled, if it must be too late for me, at least we shall fall together. The words were clearly directed at Lena, but she made no sign of having heard them. She stared at Konrad, not with fear, but with something nearer calculation. Her close gaze inspected every inch of his attire, noting the knife he held in one hand and the packet he clutched in the other.
I knew it was you, she said, when you kept appearing at my house. It was you that I saw in the bones that night, when Navi Morodova spoke. I was right.
Yes, he agreed.
You should be dead, she said then. How did you avoid my assassin? I sent the very best.
He was good, Konrad admitted, but the Malykant is not so easy to kill, I'm afraid. Lena only sneered. You knew? Gasped Lance. You've known all along that the Malykant hunted us? Konrad gave her no time to reply. His arm moved sharply, and the knife flew. Lena gasped as the long blade buried itself in her shoulder, pinning her to the wall. She struggled like a stuck butterfly, but she remained caught. In the same movement his free hand dipped into the mouth of the bag he held and emerged bearing a pinch of sunbane powder. He threw this into Lance's face, and the swarthy man stopped laughing abruptly. Instead, he choked as the powder flew down his pipes and into his lungs. His body went rigid and fell, and all movement ceased. Konrad bent over him, looking right into his eyes. For the Malykant, he murmured. For your crimes against his laws, the Overlord claims your soul. That was all. He sometimes made longer speeches, but he'd had conversation enough with this one. Navdina's sharpened rib bone was in his hand. He dropped and buried the bone in Lance's chest, listening for the puncturing sound it made as the tip pierced the killer's heart. The Malykant comes for you, he whispered, and the soul of Navdina Rostikova seeks vengeance upon you. He leaned closer. She shall have it. Fear shone bright and sharp in Lance the poison man's eyes. For a few quick seconds he continued to breathe, ragged, gasping breaths around the fluid filling his lungs. Konrad felt the familiar chill descend on the poor terraced house as the Malykant arrived to tear away his soul. Lord, he murmured, remaining on his knees for an instant out of respect. No answer came, but he did not expect any. His master waited for him to complete his task. Konrad stood, slowly. Then he turned to Lena. She wasn't looking at him. Her wide eyes were fixed on the fresh corpse that had been her lover and accomplice only a few moments ago. Her pretty face was chalk white, her trembling lips almost as red as the blood that soaked her arm and torso. She had stopped struggling, though that may have only been the paralyzing effect of shock and fear. Konrad moved until he stood directly in front of her. It was only then that she lifted her eyes to his face and met his cold gaze. But not with contrition. In an instant her manner changed from a shocked stupor to fiery anger.
"You've no right to judge me," she spat.
Konrad stilled. Had she known somehow precisely the right words to say to make him pause? Was she expecting a reprieve, some kind of weakening in him? Or was this nothing but the wild pronouncements of a mind in trauma? He was not given to self-doubt. It was one of the qualities that made him a suitable servant to death's overlord. But when he did doubt, it was on these terms. He himself was no saint. He had committed offenses of his own in the past, some of them grave. That, too, rendered him a fitting Malykant, for he was no self-righteous zealot. Like those he hunted, he had to atone for his past. But he also had more understanding than was comfortable. Sometimes he was called upon to punish the crimes of individuals whose circumstances he could relate to all too well. He could not even say for certain that he himself would have acted differently were he placed into a similar situation. Lena's case was not one of these. She had taken her revenge not on the perpetrator of the crimes against her, but against people who were uninvolved. No excuse could be made for her. Still, he could not help but sympathize with her anger at the turn her life had taken, when she had been due so much more. It made it harder to stand here as her executioner and hear her story, knowing that the ending could not be changed. He kept his face expressionless as he looked back at her, his doubts hidden. He made no reply to her accusation, merely waited. Lena lifted her chin and stared at him with pure hatred.
"Well, then, do as you must. Why do you hesitate?"
"It is no hesitation," he replied. "I must first hear your explanations," she sneered.
"I will not explain myself to you."
He smiled in a small way. "It is not to me that you must explain yourself. The Malikt hears your words." She went very still at that, her eyes darting as if she might see the overlord crouched somewhere in this pitiful room. She would not, of course. When the Malikt was near, there was no manifestation, only a presence, cold and dark and stern. Another moment passed, and she began to feel it too. He could see it in the way her breath stopped, and the fear crept back into her eyes. "Most of your story is known to me," Konrad said. "One element only remains unaccounted for."
"And what is that?"
she breathed. Blood still poured from the wound he'd created in her shoulder, and she was growing pale. "The role of your husband, Amrav Rostikov, in this tale." Her mouth twisted.
"I won him fairly, though it wasn't hard. It was Navdina that introduced us. Isn't that ironic?"
A shiver racked her body, beginning at the bleeding shoulder, still pinned to the wall.
"What?"
she added when Konrad said nothing.
"What are you really asking? Did I love him?"
Konrad narrowed his eyes. "What I am asking is, did you kill him?"
"Yes."
She said it simply, without any inflection or apparent feeling. "Why?"
"Because he knew."
He didn't have to ask what Amrav Rostikov had known. Her face told him everything. Lord Rostikov had discovered somehow that his wife had planned and ordered the killing of his cousin. Perhaps he'd also learned of her true history. Here lay the recurring and so frustrating tragedy of crimes. One led so swiftly, so easily, to another. So she had killed her husband in order to conceal her involvement in Navdina's death. But was it so simple? He remembered Lanza's words, spoken only minutes ago.
You spoke of marriage.
His death was planned, Konrad guessed. But not so soon, and not like that.
No,
she sighed.
Something accidental and undramatic, but he pried into my affairs.
Konrad recognized that tone. It said, I deny responsibility for this offense. I was pushed to it by circumstances beyond my control. The victim brought it upon himself. It never did fly with him. And Etreya? He asked. At that, her cold blue eyes turned to twin chips of ice. He shivered a little at the depths of her hatred for her former nurse, for her supposed mother. Is she dead yet? She said. No, nor will she die any time soon. Your accomplice failed. Her eyebrows rose.
I was told Igarut is always fatal.
Konrad smiled mirthlessly, thinking of Irananda. He was tricked. Lena looked as though she would like to hunt Etreya down herself and throttle her to death with her own hands. Konrad didn't doubt that she was capable of it. Why didn't you stop at killing her? Konrad asked. Not that he would have condoned the murder of poor, broken Etreya Mirodova any more than that of Lady Rostikova, but it would have made more sense. Lena shrugged and gasped with pain as the gesture pulled her torn shoulder against the knife.
My goal was not vengeance. My goal was to regain what's mine.
He shook his head. You could have publicized the story Etreya told you. She would have vouched for her part in it, I'm sure. Lena shook her head vehemently.
Not when it would have damaged Nabdina. She loved her more than she ever loved me. Of course she did. Nabdina was her child. And besides, who would believe the word of a mere nurse and her daughter? Wealth, status, these things will always win over any little matters such as truth or right.
Konrad's lip curled involuntarily. And the poison? You could have given her a quick death. Instead, you chose a prolonged and most painful one. Was that not vengeful? She stared at him with hatred.
She had my life, Lena hissed. My life. And in exchange for all those years of stolen affluence, I inflicted a mere 10 minutes' pain upon her. I was lenient.
Konrad considered this information, considered her, helpless before him and facing her own death, yet still defiant and wholly unrepentant, still capable of seeing herself as the injured party. She'd destroyed her cousin by marriage, despite the fact that Nabdina could bear no responsibility for her mother's actions. She had further planned and carried out the murders of her husband and her former nurse in order to cover her earlier crime and secure her position as the only possible recipient of the Rostikov title and fortunes. She had concealed her knowledge of the Malykant's hunt from her accomplice, Lanz, probably hoping that he would bear the brunt of the Malik's vengeance instead of her. And all of this had been done with no apparent compunction at all. "Thank you," he said at last. He took the knife from her shoulder, and she drew in a quick breath, a gasp of mingled pain and fear. She swayed, on the point of collapse. "And now?" she said, with the barest hint of a tremor. "Amrav is waiting," Konrad replied. Her body tensed just for a split second. He had been waiting for that. Gathering her flagging strength, she bolted, running for the door. But he was too fast for her. He tossed a handful of the powder into her path, and she ran full into it. In seconds she had fallen to the ground beside her lover, all her striving reduced to the simple effort to breathe through paralyzed throat and chest. Konrad stood looking down at her for an instant. He took no pleasure in this part of his role. If he had, he would have been no true Malykant, no better in fact than herself. But he could do it, because he must. And because that part of himself that would have screamed and wept at his actions was gone, taken by his master. The bone was in his hand, its sharpened tip ready. Her eyes moved in her drawn face, and she watched its progress as he knelt over her. What was she thinking behind those frightened, defiant eyes? Did she know that her soul would be bound to her murdered husband's until she had paid for his death? Did she guess how fierce the torment would be? Deliberately he put those thoughts away from his mind and raised the bone. A single gesture, and it was done. The stake was buried in her heart. Her life drained away, and Annalina's soul was given into the unforgiving care of the malict. Konrad waited in silence while his master's work was completed. When the overlord's presence had drained away, and only the familiar, unthreatening chill of winter remained in the room, he stood. He gazed for a moment at the twin corpses of Lance the Poison Man and Lena Morodova lying side by side, the bones of their victims piercing their cold hearts. Then he left the house, stepping out into the drifting snow that fell softly from the darkened skies.
You've been listening to The Rostikov Legacy, written by Charlotte E. English. Read for you by Wayne June. Copyright 2018 by Charlotte E. English. Production copyright 2022 by Charlotte E. English.
Epilogue. Irananda was still asleep when Konrad returned to the house on stilts high among the trees. He swung himself up to the trap-door with slow care, unwilling to disturb her. She didn't wake as he moved about the room, cleaning the blood from his hands and replacing his blood-spattered clothes. But when he moved to the bedside and stood looking down at her sleeping face, she woke almost immediately. Her pale eyes opened slowly, and she stared up at him, her face white and drawn within the tangled nest of her white blonde hair. "Are you well?" he asked after a moment. She looked healthier than she had when he left. She was at least lucid, and her breathing was regular. But she remained so white and weak. "I should be dead," she said flatly. "Or worse." She moved to sit up, but he held her down. "Stay," he murmured. "You still need rest." "I'm fine," she snapped, but Konrad wouldn't relax his grip. At last she sank back into the pillows with a harassed sigh. "I should be dead," she repeated. "But I'm not. What did you do?" Konrad said nothing. Nanda knew he couldn't answer that question. If she knew that, she didn't accept it. He saw contempt in her eyes at his silence, and his soul shriveled a little further. "Where have you been?" she said then. He sighed and lifted his eyes to the ceiling. He couldn't answer that either, not that he needed to. She knew where he'd been. "Nanda," he said seriously, "your help was truly important. Thank you." He received nothing but a stiff nod in answer to that, and "I'm sorry that you were endangered by it." Some of her frigidity softened at that. "I was the one who insisted, as I recall." There were a number of possible responses he could have made to that. He didn't need to have given in to her questions and guesses. He hadn't been obliged to give her a task, and he shouldn't have sent her after a man who was obviously so dangerous. But the slight thaw in her manner was pleasant, and he didn't want to risk ruining it with these uncomfortable truths. "What's next?" she said, her eyes searching his face. She'd find no hint of a clue there, he knew, as his face was impassive as always. "I'll take care of you until you're well, then I'll go back to the city." "Back to being a gentleman," she said with faint scorn. "Until?" "Well, until next time."
"What's it like?"
The question took him by surprise. He was still more surprised to realize that he wanted to answer it. He badly wanted to talk to someone about the strange double life he lived, but he couldn't, not really, not even when it was Nanda. "It is a purpose," he said finally. He expected another surge of anger from her at this vague response, but if anything, she looked rather sad.
"Some day you'll tell me more," she told him. "I am determined."
Konrad inclined his head, permitting himself a small smile. He felt a brief flush of warmth at those words. "Someday" meant that they were still friends, that she expected to remain friends for some time yet. If she wasn't already repulsed by the things he did as the Malykant, then maybe there was hope for them after all. Maybe he wouldn't lose the only friend he had. "Maybe I will," he replied. Someday.